Welcome, dear listener, to a journey back in time to the Middle Ages, an era of knights, castles, lords, and serfs. Imagine yourself lying in bed, your body cushioned by the soft glow of moonlight streaming through the curtains. Let your mind wander into this captivating period that has fascinated the human imagination for centuries. The Middle Ages, spanning from the 5th to the 15th century, began with the fall of the Western Roman Empire and merged into the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery. Picture a landscape dotted with grand castles, their stone walls standing tall against the backdrop of the sky. Picture villages of thatched-roof cottages, their chimneys puffing out smoke. Picture the people, nobles in fine silks, peasants in simple clothes, monks in solemn robes. Hear the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the lowing of cows, and the bustling of the market. However, life in this era was far from the romanticized version we often see in movies or read in books. It was a period characterized by great struggle and adversity. The average life expectancy was around 30 years, and a vast majority of the populace lived in abject poverty. Sanitation was poor, disease was rampant, and the threat of war was an ever-present reality. One of the most striking differences between our time and the Middle Ages is the lack of modern conveniences that we take for granted. Imagine a life devoid of electricity, running water, and central heating during the winter. You would have to depend on a fireplace for warmth, risking the fire going out in the middle of the night. In the summer, there was no escape from the scorching heat and the swarms of insects that accompanied it. You might think that the simple act of eating would provide some respite from these hardships, but even this was fraught with difficulty. Food was often scarce and of poor quality. The diet of the average peasant was limited to bread, vegetables, and a small amount of dairy. Meat was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. Even if you were fortunate enough to obtain some, there were no refrigerators to keep it fresh. Food poisoning was a common occurrence and could easily prove fatal. Water, too, was not as readily available as it is today. Wells were the primary source of drinking water, but these were often contaminated. As a result, people frequently drank ale or beer as the alcohol killed some of the harmful bacteria. However, this led to another set of problems, as excessive drinking was common. Hygiene was another area in which medieval times differed significantly from today. Bathing was not a daily or even weekly occurrence. In fact, it was believed that bathing opened the pores to disease and was avoided whenever possible. As a result, people often had lice, fleas, and other parasites. The lack of dental care meant that tooth decay was rampant, and the solution was usually extraction without any form of anesthesia. Medicine, too, was a far cry from what we know today. Doctors had a limited understanding of the human body and disease, and their treatments were often more harmful than helpful. Bloodletting was a common practice, based on the belief that it could balance the body's humors. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, and the mortality rate was extremely high. Let's continue our journey through medieval times with a closer look at the living conditions. If you're accustomed to modern conveniences like running water, electricity, or even a comfortable bed, medieval times would have been a complete shock to your system. Houses during this era were typically constructed with a wooden frame filled with wattle and daub, a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung. The roofs were thatched with straw, providing some insulation, but the walls were thin, and the homes lacked any real heating source, making winters extremely cold. Fireplaces were a luxury that few could afford, so most people huddled around a central hearth for warmth. The smoke from this open fire had to escape through a hole in the roof, which meant that the interior of the home was often filled with smoke. Imagine trying to find comfort in such a setting, huddled with your family members, your eyes stinging from the smoke. Most homes consisted of a single room that served multiple purposes. This same room was used for cooking and eating, as well as sleeping. Privacy was virtually unheard of, as entire families would sleep together in the same space, often on a single bed of straw. If you found the idea of sharing a bedroom with a sibling frustrating as a child, imagine sharing a bed with your entire family. Sanitation, or rather the lack of it, would be another major shock to the modern system. There were no bathrooms as we know them. Instead, people used chamber pots, which were emptied out of windows and onto the streets below. The waste would then run down the streets and into the local rivers, which were also the primary sources of drinking water. This resulted in rampant disease, from dysentery to the plague. The smell alone would have been enough to make the strongest stomachs churn. This brings us to the topic of personal hygiene. The idea of daily showers would have been unimaginable to the people of the Middle Ages. Most people bathed rarely, and when they did, it was often in the local river or a community bathhouse. These bathhouses, while offering a communal bathing space, also served as breeding grounds for bacteria and diseases. During this era, there was a prevailing belief that bathing opened the pores to disease, leading many to bathe as infrequently as possible. Consequently, people often carried a strong odor, which was only masked by the use of herbs and flowers. Food in the Middle Ages was vastly different from what we're accustomed to today. The average person's diet consisted mainly of bread, cheese, and ale. Meat was a luxury that few could afford, and fresh fruits and vegetables were not a common part of the diet. Malnutrition was a prevalent issue due to the lack of essential vitamins and nutrients in the diet. However, there were moments of joy and celebration, often centered around religious holidays and feasts. Music and dance were integral parts of medieval culture, providing a much-needed escape from the harsh realities of daily life. People would gather in the village square to dance, sing, and celebrate. Even in the darkest times, the human spirit finds ways to shine through. As we conclude this chapter, take a moment to appreciate the comforts of modern life the next time you take a hot shower, sleep in a warm bed, or enjoy a fresh, healthy meal. Remember how far we've come. The Middle Ages may have been a time of great cultural and intellectual growth, but they were also a time of hardship and struggle. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit that we've come so far. In our next section, we'll delve deeper into the social structure of the Middle Ages, exploring the roles of the king, nobles, knights, and peasants. Stay tuned and let the soothing rhythm of history lull you into a peaceful slumber. As the sun rises over the horizon, our medieval day begins. Life in the Middle Ages was dictated by the sun, in a world devoid of electricity. Daylight held immense value. Every ray of sun was meticulously utilized for essential chores and tasks. Imagine the luxury of a leisurely Sunday morning. Think again. Medieval folk were early risers, typically waking up at the crack of dawn, as signaled by the crowing of a rooster or the tolling of the local church bell. Once out of bed, people dressed in simple tunics made of coarse wool, linen, or hemp, depending on their wealth and status. The wealthy might have clothes dyed in vibrant colors and crafted from finer materials, but the majority wore drab, practical clothing, reminiscent of the sackcloth of biblical fame. Shoes were a luxury, with most peasants going barefoot, especially during the warmer months. The first meal of the day was breakfast, but it was far from the indulgent feast of bacon, eggs, and toast we're accustomed to. Medieval breakfast was a frugal affair, often consisting of a chunk of bread, some cheese, and, if fortunate, a bit of cold meat or fish from the previous night's meal. This was washed down with a mug of ale, or, for the wealthier, wine. Yes, you heard that right. Water was often unsafe to drink due to inadequate sanitation, so low-alcohol ale and wine were common beverages, even for children. After breakfast, it was straight to work. The majority of medieval people were peasants, working the land for the local lord. Their days were filled with arduous physical labor, including plowing fields, sowing seeds, tending animals, and harvesting crops. Even children were expected to contribute with tasks suitable for their age and strength. The work was backbreaking, and the hours were long. From dawn until dusk, the fields and pastures buzzed with activity, with only a brief respite at midday for a meal and rest. If you were fortunate enough to be a craftsman, your day might involve working in a shop or at a market stall, selling your wares. Blacksmiths, bakers, carpenters, and weavers were all vital to the medieval economy. Their skills were highly sought after, and their products, such as horseshoes, bread, furniture, and cloth, were essential for daily life. However, these jobs were not without their challenges. The work was often hazardous, with a risk of injury or even death from accidents or fires. In contrast, the life of a noble or knight was vastly different. They did not toil in the fields but were occupied with their own duties and responsibilities. They managed their estates, administered justice, trained for war, and engaged in politics. The noble's day was filled with meetings, decisions, and paperwork, much like a modern CEO. As the sun set, the day's work would conclude. Supper was the main meal of the day, typically consisting of a hearty stew made of meat, vegetables, and grains. The wealthier one was, the more varied and extravagant their diet would be. The rich feasted on roasted meats, exotic spices, and sweet pastries, all washed down with fine wines. After supper, people would gather around the hearth for a few hours of relaxation before bed. They might share stories, play simple games, or simply enjoy the warmth and companionship of their family and friends. Then, as the last embers in the hearth died out, it was time for bed. Beds were simple affairs, often just a pile of straw covered with a blanket. Only the wealthy had the luxury of a wooden bedstead, a stuffed mattress, and feather pillows. As you lay down to sleep, you would be aware of the silence broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant howl of a wolf. There were no streetlights, cars, or electric hum, only the darkness and the quiet. With that, your day in the medieval times would come to an end, ready to start anew with the crowing of the rooster at dawn. As you settle into your comfortable modern bed tonight, spare a thought for our medieval ancestors. Their lives were hard, and their comforts were few, but they made the best of what they had. They worked, laughed, loved, and slept, just like we do. In essence, they were just like us, except their world was vastly different. As we delve deeper into the details of medieval life, we find ourselves standing amidst a bustling medieval marketplace, overwhelmed by a sensory onslaught of sights, sounds, and smells. This marketplace served as the economic heart of medieval society, a vibrant hub where merchants and craftsmen showcased their wares, while peasants flocked to purchase essential goods for survival. Imagine the cacophony of vendors hawking their products, the rhythmic clatter of carts, and the lowing of livestock. The air was filled with the enticing aroma of freshly baked bread wafting from the baker's stall, juxtaposed with the less pleasant scent of unwashed people and animals. Goods in medieval times ranged from foodstuffs like bread, cheese, and vegetables to manufactured items such as clothing, household goods, and tools. Notably, currency was not as prevalent as it is today. Instead, bartering was the norm, with goods and services being exchanged for one another. For instance, a craftsperson might trade a handcrafted tool for a sack of grain or a pair of shoes. Food played a crucial role in daily life during the Middle Ages. Contrary to popular belief, medieval cuisine was not limited to gruel and stale bread. The diet of the average person revolved around grains like barley, oats, rye, and wheat. Bread, porridge, and ale made from these grains were staples. Vegetables such as cabbages, onions, garlic, and leeks were commonly consumed, along with fruits like apples, pears, and berries. Meat and fish were also part of the diet, but they were consumed less frequently, typically reserved for those of higher social status or for special occasions. Now imagine the water you drink and the food you eat being prepared in medieval conditions. Back then, there was no knowledge of bacteria and their role in causing disease. Water was often sourced directly from rivers or wells, which could be contaminated with human and animal waste. Food was frequently stored in unsanitary conditions, and refrigeration was non-existent. This combination led to frequent outbreaks of diseases such as dysentery and cholera. Beyond the marketplace, the other vibrant hub of activity in the medieval village was the manor, the residence of the local lord. The lord held the highest authority in the village, responsible for maintaining law and order, administering justice, and safeguarding the villagers from external threats. In return for his services, the villagers were expected to work the lord's lands and pay him rent in the form of goods or services. The manor house itself was a substantial fortified structure, often encircled by a moat for protection. Inside, it boasted a grand hall where the lord held court, a chapel for religious ceremonies, and private chambers for the lord and his family. Despite its grandeur, life within the manor house was not luxurious by modern standards. There was no indoor plumbing, and heating was provided by large smoky fires. However, the lord's power was not absolute. He was subject to the king, who held ultimate authority. The relationship between the lord and the king was based on a system of mutual obligations known as feudalism. The lord pledged his loyalty to the king and provided military service when required. In return, the king granted the lord lands and rights over the people who resided on them. This feudal system was a fundamental aspect of medieval society, establishing a hierarchical structure of power and privilege. At the apex were the king and the nobility, who owned the land and wielded significant wealth. Below them were the knights, who offered military service in exchange for land and status. At the base of this hierarchy were the peasants, who labored the land and possessed limited rights and freedoms. In the subsequent section, we will delve into the harsh realities of medieval warfare and the pivotal role of knights in society. Let's take a moment to reflect on the fact that this was a time when survival was a daily struggle, and the creature comforts we enjoy today were unimaginable luxuries. As we drift off into a peaceful sleep, let's appreciate the comforts and conveniences of our modern lives and the progress made over the centuries. The Middle Ages were a time of great hardship and adversity, but also remarkable resilience and innovation. Life was difficult, but people found ways to adapt and survive, creating beauty and meaning amidst their challenges. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Middle Ages is the human spirit's capacity to endure and flourish, even in the harshest circumstances. As we close our eyes and surrender to sleep, let's carry this thought into our dreams, a reminder of our inner strength and resilience. Now, let's delve deeper into the daily life of the medieval period. The rhythm of the day was quite different from our modern times. The sun served as the primary indicator of time, necessitating early rising for survival. A typical day began at dawn with a quick meal called breakfast, derived from the Old English breakfaster, meaning to break the night's fast. This simple meal usually consisted of a chunk of bread, some cheese, and perhaps a cup of ale. After breakfast, the majority of the day was dedicated to work, which varied greatly depending on one's social status. Peasants, the majority of the population, faced grueling physical labor. As farmers, they worked the land to produce the food needed to feed the entire kingdom. Their daily tasks included planting and harvesting crops, raising livestock, and performing any other necessary duties to maintain their estates. If you were born into the nobility, your day would be vastly different. While nobles didn't have to perform physical labor, they were responsible for managing the land and the people who lived on it. They made crucial decisions about planting and harvesting crops, distributing resources, and defending their land in case of conflict. This was no easy task, demanding strategic thinking and interpersonal skills. The middle class, comprising merchants and craftsmen, also had their own set of responsibilities. Merchants' days involved acquiring goods and selling them in the market. They had to keep track of their inventory, negotiate prices, and navigate the intricate world of medieval trade. Craftsmen, on the other hand, spent their days creating the goods sold in the market. They had to master their craft, whether it was blacksmithing, weaving, or carpentry, and produce high-quality products that would sell well. Lunch, the main meal of the day, was taken around midday. It was a more substantial meal than breakfast and typically consisted of several courses. Bread remained the staple, accompanied by meat or fish, vegetables, and a variety of sauces and spices. The meal was washed down with ale or wine, as water was often unsafe to drink. After lunch, work resumed until dusk. The evening meal was similar to breakfast, a simple and quick affair. After this, people retired to their beds. There was no concept of leisure time as we know it today. Free time was a luxury that few could afford. The medieval period was a time of hard work and simplicity. Life was dictated by the seasons and the demands of survival. Despite its hardships, it was also a time of community and shared responsibility. People relied on each other for survival and worked together to ensure the well-being of their community. It was a time when the line between life and death was often thin. But it was also a time when people truly lived in the moment, acutely aware of life's fragility and the significance of each day. As we traverse the medieval era, let's remember the vast differences between our modern lives and those of our ancestors. While it's tempting to romanticize the past, the reality was often far more intricate and challenging. However, it's equally important to recognize that our ancestors were just as human as we are. They laughed, cried, loved, and dreamed just like we do. They were products of their time, just as we are products of ours. As we delve deeper into their lives, we gain a profound understanding of our own history and perhaps even a fresh perspective on our own lives. As you close your eyes and drift off to sleep, let your mind wander back to the medieval times. Imagine the sound of the rooster crowing at dawn, the aroma of freshly baked bread wafting through the air, and the refreshing sensation of the cool morning breeze on your face as you step outside to begin your day. Let these vivid images lull you into a peaceful slumber as we prepare to continue our journey through the medieval era in our next session. As we venture further into the medieval period, we immerse ourselves in the everyday lives of the average person, stepping into the shoes of a medieval peasant. The life of a peasant during this era was a stark contrast to the lives we lead today, characterized by hardships and adversity that are difficult for us to fully comprehend. Their day commenced at dawn, with the first light of day signaling the start of their labor-intensive routines, long before the invention of alarm clocks. The majority of peasants were farmers whose lives were dictated by the changing seasons and their ability to grow crops. In the spring, they would begin plowing their fields using rudimentary tools made from wood and iron, a grueling task that often took several weeks to complete. Once the fields were plowed, they would sow seeds for their crops, which included wheat, barley, oats, rye, and legumes. The work was backbreaking, requiring long hours of physical labor in the fields. After seeding, the peasants focused on maintaining their crops during the summer months, weeding and ensuring they received enough water. This was a constant battle against nature, as unexpected storms or droughts could easily destroy their hard work and leave them without food for the coming winter. When autumn arrived, it was time for the peasants to reap what they had sown. The harvest was crucial, determining whether they would have enough food to survive the winter. After the harvest, the remaining stalks and straw were used for various purposes, such as fodder for livestock, bedding for the family, and thatch for their homes. Winter, in contrast, was a time of relative inactivity. The fields lay fallow, and the peasants spent their time repairing their homes and tools, as well as tending to their livestock, which included cattle, sheep, pigs, and chickens. These animals provided essential resources like milk, wool, meat, and eggs. In addition to farming, peasants also had to pay taxes to their feudal lord. These taxes were often paid in the form of crops or labor, and it was not uncommon for a peasant to spend several days each year working on the lord's lands as part of their tax obligation. This was known as the corvée system and was a significant burden on the peasant population. Despite the hardships, life wasn't always work for the peasants. They did have some time for rest and recreation. Sundays were usually reserved for rest and worship. The church played a significant role in the lives of the peasants, offering them spiritual guidance and a sense of community. Festivals and holy days provided them with an opportunity to take a break from their labor and celebrate with their friends and neighbors. Marriages and births were occasions for celebration, and even the harshness of winter brought with it the joy of Christmas festivities. Music and dance were popular forms of entertainment, and despite their challenging lives, the peasants found ways to express their creativity and joy. However, the life of a peasant in medieval times was undoubtedly difficult. The physical labor was intense, the diet was poor, and the living conditions were often cramped and unsanitary. Illness and disease were common, and the average life expectancy was significantly lower than it is today. Despite these conditions, the medieval peasant was a resilient individual. They adapted to their circumstances, found joy in the simple pleasures of life, and formed close-knit communities that helped them survive. Their lives were far from easy, but they laid the groundwork for many of the farming practices we still use today. As we drift off to sleep tonight, let's appreciate the comforts and conveniences of modern life that we often take for granted. As we journey further into the past, we continue to gain perspective on our present, understanding the struggles and triumphs that have shaped our world. In our next section, we will explore the world of the medieval knight, delving deeper into the intricate layers of medieval society. But for now, let's let the rhythm of a peasant's life lull us into a peaceful and restful slumber. Good night. The feudal system, the primary social structure during the medieval period, resembled a pyramid. At its apex stood the king, who bestowed land upon his most esteemed noblemen, known as barons. Below the barons were the knights, while at the very base resided the peasants, comprising the vast majority of the population. Life at the top of the pyramid was relatively comfortable. Kings and noblemen resided in grand castles, accompanied by servants who catered to their every desire. They indulged in a diverse array of foods, including meat, fish, and exotic fruits, while donning luxurious attire crafted from silk and velvet. Despite these comforts, their lives were far from effortless. Kings and noblemen were perpetually embroiled in political maneuvering and warfare, striving to safeguard their lands and augment their power. Knights, situated in the middle of the social pyramid, experienced a slightly different existence. They were granted land by their lords in exchange for their military service. Knights were expected to be courageous, chivalrous, and proficient in combat. Their lives were dominated by warfare and the pursuit of honor. Despite the romanticized image we hold of knights today, their lives were often brutal and short. Many knights perished young, either in battle or as a consequence of injuries sustained. Life at the bottom of the pyramid, the life of a peasant, was incredibly arduous. Peasants labored tirelessly in the fields, cultivating crops to sustain themselves and their lords. They resided in simple one-room huts with dirt floors and minimal possessions. Their diet primarily consisted of bread, vegetables, and occasionally a bit of cheese or bacon. Despite their hard work, peasants were often at the mercy of their lords, who could arbitrarily raise rents or demand additional labor at any time. The medieval period was also characterized by religious fervor. The Catholic Church emerged as the dominant religious institution, exerting profound influence over every facet of life. The Pope, regarded as God's earthly representative, wielded immense power. People were expected to attend church services regularly, pay tithes to the church, and live their lives according to Christian teachings. Those who didn't were considered heretics and could face severe punishment, including excommunication or even death. Despite widespread illiteracy, the Middle Ages were also a time of great intellectual activity. Monasteries were the centers of learning, where monks painstakingly copied out books by hand. These works, many of which were religious texts, were the primary source of knowledge during this time. The medieval era was a time of stark contrasts. On one hand, it was a time of great beauty, with the construction of magnificent cathedrals and the creation of stunning works of art. On the other hand, it was a time of great brutality and suffering, with constant warfare, widespread poverty, and a lack of basic human rights. As we continue our journey through the medieval era, we will explore more about the lives of the people who lived during this time, the challenges they faced, and the innovations they made. Despite the hardships, the medieval period was a time of great change and progress, setting the stage for the modern world we know today. Imagine living in this era. The sounds of the marketplace, the smell of the earth after a day in the fields, the taste of simple, hearty food after a hard day's work. Let the stress and worries of your day fade away, replaced by a feeling of peace and tranquility. Let us continue our in-depth exploration into the daily life of the medieval period. As our journey through time unfolds, you might begin to realize that a day in the life of a medieval individual was far from the romanticized versions often depicted in popular culture. For the average person living in medieval Europe, life was far from easy. The day would begin at dawn with the first light of the sun. Most people lived in small one-room houses with thatched roofs, offering little in the way of privacy or comfort. The medieval period was characterized by a stark contrast between the lives of the wealthy and the poor. The lower classes, primarily peasants, lived in cramped, dirt-floored dwellings with minimal furniture, such as a rough-hewn table and benches. In the corner, a small fire pit provided warmth and a means of cooking. Livestock often shared the same living space, adding to the discomfort. Each day began with chores dictated by social status and occupation. Peasants, the majority of the population, worked tirelessly from sunrise to sunset, tilling the fields, planting crops, and caring for livestock. Their diet consisted mainly of bread, porridge, and vegetables, with meat and fruits being luxuries reserved for the wealthy. This lack of variety and nutrition often led to health problems like malnutrition and scurvy. Life in towns and cities was not much better. Narrow, crowded, and dirty streets were littered with waste and garbage, posing significant sanitation challenges and contributing to frequent disease outbreaks. The bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, devastated Europe in the 14th century, claiming a third of its population. Beyond the physical hardships, the psychological toll of living in a society where life was cheap and violence was commonplace weighed heavily on people. Constant threats of war, with kingdoms and fiefdoms frequently at odds, created an atmosphere of uncertainty. Public executions were common, and the rule of law was often arbitrary and brutal. Despite these hardships, medieval people found ways to enjoy life. Festivals and holidays were celebrated with great enthusiasm, often featuring music, dance, and copious amounts of alcohol. Religion also played a crucial role, providing a sense of purpose and community. Religion was not merely a matter of personal belief, but an integral part of daily life. The church held a significant role in the community, offering not only spiritual guidance, but also essential social services. The local priest, often the sole literate individual in the village, performed weddings, funerals, and baptisms, and even provided basic medical care. In essence, life during the medieval period was a constant struggle for survival. It was a time of harsh realities, where the average person endured hard labor, poor nutrition, and constant uncertainty. However, it was also a period of profound faith and communal bonds, where people found joy in the simple pleasures of life. If you were to spend a day in medieval times, you would likely find it challenging yet profoundly human. As we delve deeper into the medieval era, we will explore the intricacies of daily life, the societal structure, and the cultural beliefs that shaped this captivating period in history. So, close your eyes and imagine a world vastly different from our own, where life was simple, yet fraught with challenges. We will continue our journey through the ages, immersing ourselves in the sights, sounds, and experiences of the medieval times. As we venture into the gripping yet often unsettling world of medieval times, let us now turn our attention to the intricate social order of the period, which was a stark contrast to what we are accustomed to in our modern democratic societies. In the medieval world, one's birth and social standing had a profound impact on their life. The social structure was rigidly hierarchical, and opportunities for social mobility were scarce. At the pinnacle of the social pyramid stood the monarch, the ultimate authority who ruled by divine right. The king was the law. His word was final, and his power was absolute. Just below the king were the nobles, a privileged class that enjoyed wealth, power, and prestige. The nobility, owning vast tracts of land, residing in opulent castles, and commanding private armies, also had obligations. They were expected to provide military service to the king, administer justice, and maintain order in their territories. Beneath the nobles were the knights, a warrior class who owed their allegiance to a lord. Knights were professional soldiers, trained from a young age to fight in the king's wars. They were rewarded with land and privileges, but their lives were not easy. They were expected to be brave, loyal, and honorable, upholding the chivalric code, and ready to sacrifice their lives for their lord and king. Next came the clergy, who held a unique position in medieval society. They were not only spiritual leaders, but also wielded significant temporal power. The church, the richest and most powerful institution in medieval Europe, owned vast estates, collected tithes, and exerted influence over all societal levels. The clergy were often the only literate people in the community, playing a crucial role in education, charity, and administration. At the bottom of the social pyramid were the peasants, the largest and most disadvantaged group in medieval society. They worked the land, tilled the fields, and tended the livestock, their labor providing the food and resources that sustained the entire society. However, they were often treated as mere chattels, bound to the land and their lord, with limited rights and little hope of improving their circumstances. Life as a peasant was arduous and unrelenting. Their working day began at dawn and ended at dusk, with only brief breaks for meals. The work was physically demanding, with no respite, no weekends, and no holidays. Yet the fruits of their labor mostly went to their lord in the form of rent, taxes, and services. Food was simple and monotonous, consisting of bread, porridge, and vegetables, with meat and fish being a rare luxury. Clothing was coarse and practical, made from wool or linen, and often worn until it deteriorated. Homes were small, dark, and crowded, with entire families residing in a single room. Peasants were subject to the authority of their lord, who wielded immense power over nearly every aspect of their lives. They could be bought, sold, or given away at the lord's discretion. Harsh punishments were meted out for any transgression, real or imagined, and justice was scarce as the legal system was heavily biased in favor of the nobility. Despite these hardships, peasants possessed a degree of agency. They maintained their own customs and traditions, developing unique ways of understanding the world. They celebrated the changing seasons, the harvest and holy days, finding joy and solace in their communities and faith. As we conclude this section of our journey, let us pause to reflect on the resilience and tenacity of the human spirit, even in the face of such adversity. While the medieval peasants' world may appear harsh and unforgiving to us now, it was their reality, their daily existence, and they found ways to endure, survive, and even thrive in their own humble manner. As you drift off to sleep, let the echoes of their lives, struggles, and triumphs lull you into a deep, peaceful slumber filled with dreams of a bygone era, yet not entirely forgotten. Remember, as the dawn of a new day breaks, that we too face challenges, struggles, and triumphs, and that we are all part of the intricate tapestry of human history, just as complex and captivating as the world of the medieval times. Good night. As we continue our journey through the Middle Ages, let's shift our focus to the daily lives of the common people. It's easy to envision the glamorous knights and the grandeur of the towering castles. However, the reality of medieval times was often far removed from this romanticized vision. To truly comprehend the challenges of this era, we must delve into the lives of the everyday people who formed the backbone of medieval society. The majority of people during the Middle Ages were peasants, and their daily lives revolved around hard work. They resided in small villages and worked on the land, cultivating crops or raising animals. The day commenced at dawn with the crowing of the rooster. The lives of peasants were dictated by the sun and the seasons. In the winter months, when daylight was scarce, they would rise later, but in the summer, they were often up before sunrise, preparing for a long day of toil in the fields. Their homes were simple, typically 1 or 2 room structures made of wood or wattle and daub, a mixture of mud, straw, and manure. The floors were usually compacted earth, and there was a hole in the roof to vent smoke from the fire. Furniture was minimal and crude, and they slept on straw pallets covered with skins or coarse cloth. A peasant's home served as their place of eating, sleeping, and working on their craft, whether it was weaving, brewing, or blacksmithing. Work was relentless for the medieval peasant. Their primary responsibility was to produce food. They plowed, sowed seeds, and harvested crops. Additionally, they took care of animals, milking cows, making cheese, and collecting eggs. Beyond these tasks, they were also responsible for building and repairing their homes and tools. Every family member, including children, was expected to contribute in some way. Beyond their grueling work, peasants also had obligations to their lord. In exchange for the right to live on and work a piece of land, they owed their lord a certain number of days' labor each year. This was known as the corvée and could include tasks such as building roads, bridges, and fortifications, or harvesting the lord's crops. The diet of a medieval peasant was simple and monotonous. They consumed a lot of bread, usually made from rye or barley, as well as vegetables like cabbage, beans, onions, and peas. Meat, a rare luxury, was typically reserved for special occasions. Instead, peasants often feasted on fish caught in local rivers or streams. Their drink of choice was usually ale or beer, as water was often unsafe to drink. Despite the hardships, there were moments of joy and community in a peasant's life. They celebrated the changing of the seasons, the harvest, and religious holidays with feasts, music, and dance. These moments of mirth and merriment provided a much-needed respite from the monotony of their daily lives. However, the life of a medieval peasant was fraught with uncertainty. Crop failure due to adverse weather or pests could lead to famine. Even in good times, the threat of disease loomed large. Without modern medicine, a simple infection could be fatal. Moreover, the constant threat of war loomed over their heads. If their village was in the path of an advancing army, they could lose everything. By understanding the life of the medieval peasant, we can appreciate the immense challenges they faced. Their existence was often brutal and short, yet they endured, and their labor laid the foundation for the society we know today. As we conclude this section, let's pause to reflect on the remarkable resilience of these humble individuals who labored tirelessly from dawn till dusk. Their stories, often overshadowed by the grand tales of knights and kings in medieval times, are a testament to their enduring spirit. During that era, the majority of the populace were serfs, a type of peasant who worked the land they toiled upon. This land was owned by a lord, who in turn owed allegiance to a higher lord, and so on, culminating in the king. Serf life was characterized by relentless labor, dictated by the changing seasons and the demands of their lord. Their day began at the crack of dawn, with the first light of day serving as their alarm clock. Serfs would start by feeding their animals, which often included cows, sheep, and chickens. These animals were crucial to their livelihood, providing milk, wool, eggs, and occasionally meat. Depending on the time of year, serfs would head to the fields. They might sow seeds, harvest crops, or plow the fields. These physically demanding tasks involved hours of back-breaking work, often under the harsh elements. There were no weekends or holidays for serfs. Their work was never truly done. After a long day in the fields, serfs would return home. Their homes were simple one-room structures, often shared with their animals. Windows were typically made of wood, and the floors were made of hard-packed earth. The only furniture would be a rough wooden table and stools. Dinner was a simple affair, consisting of dark bread made from rye and a thin soup made from vegetables grown in their garden. Meat was a rarity, reserved for special occasions. Meals were eaten by the light of a tallow candle made from animal fat. Despite the hardships of their daily lives, serfs found joy in simple pleasures. They would often sing songs while working in the fields, a practice that helped lighten their labor on Sundays. They attended church, a mandatory requirement, but also a chance to socialize with their neighbors. However, the life of a serf was not just hard work. They were subject to the whims and wishes of their lord. If the lord decided to go to war, the serfs were expected to fight, a dangerous proposition as they often lacked proper training and equipment. The life of a serf was also precarious. A bad harvest could lead to starvation, and disease was a constant threat. Without access to modern medical treatments, a simple injury or illness could easily turn deadly. As we delve into the tapestry of history, it becomes evident that our modern conveniences are a product of centuries of progress. The next time you yearn for the simplicity of a bygone era, consider the lives of the serfs of medieval times. Their lives were anything but simple, filled with hard labor, constant uncertainty, and a lack of basic comforts. In the next section, we will explore the social hierarchy of medieval times and delve into the lives of the lords and ladies. But for now, let the sound of my voice and the images of medieval life lull you into a peaceful sleep. Remember, the past is a different country. They do things differently there. As we journey through history, we gain a greater appreciation for the comforts and conveniences of our modern world. So, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the stories of the past guide you into dreamland. Good night. As we continue our exploration of the medieval period, we find ourselves in the heart of medieval society, the village. These communities were not just clusters of homes, but intricate systems of survival and cooperation, bound by a shared necessity to work the land and serve the lord of the manor. The typical medieval village consisted of families living in close proximity to each other, with houses built from local materials. In England, these dwellings were typically constructed using wattle and daub, a method involving the weaving of pliable branches and the covering of the walls with a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung. The roofs were thatched with reeds or straw, and a hole in the roof allowed smoke from the fire to escape. These houses were small and dark, with limited windows due to the high cost of glass. Life in the village commenced early in the day, with the cockscrow signaling the start of another day of labor. The majority of the villagers were serfs, individuals bound to the land and obligated to provide labor services to the lord of the manor. These services varied, but generally included plowing the lord's fields, harvesting his crops, and maintaining his roads and fences. In return, the serfs were permitted to work their own plots of land to produce food for their families. The medieval diet was far from the diverse and balanced meals we savor today. Most peasants subsisted on a diet of bread, cheese, and vegetables, with meat being a rare indulgence. Ale was often safer to drink than water, as the brewing process eliminated bacteria. However, it was weak and not the intoxicating beverage we might imagine. Children and adults alike would have consumed it throughout the day. While the life of a serf was characterized by hard labor, there were moments of celebration and relaxation, such as the end of the harvest, when villagers would feast and dance. The church also provided a framework of festivals and holy days, offering a respite from the daily toil. These occasions were eagerly anticipated, with villages indulging in food, drink, and merriment. Nevertheless, medieval villages lived under the constant threat of disease. The unsanitary conditions in which they resided made them susceptible to outbreaks of illness. The Black Death, which swept across Europe in the 14th century, decimated entire villages, leaving fields untended and livestock roaming freely. The lack of medical knowledge and the belief in supernatural causes for diseases made these outbreaks all the more deadly. Despite the hardships, there was a strong sense of community within the village. Everyone had a role to play and depended on their neighbors for survival. The shared experiences of work, celebration, and adversity created strong bonds between villagers. They supported each other through difficult times and shared in each other's joys and sorrows. However, this sense of community also had a darker side. Villagers were suspicious of outsiders and anything that deviated from the norm. This fear of the unknown could lead to accusations of witchcraft and other forms of supernatural mischief. These accusations could have dire consequences, with those accused often being ostracized, tortured, or even killed. As we delve deeper into the realities of life in the medieval period, it becomes clear that surviving in these times required strength, resilience, and a strong sense of community. It was a time of hard work and hardship, but also one of shared experiences and communal ties. Life in a medieval village was not for the faint of heart, but for those who could bear the toil and danger. It was a life lived to the rhythm of the seasons and the demands of the land. As we continue our journey through the medieval period, let's remember the serfs and their struggles, and appreciate the relative comfort and safety of our own lives. As we continue to weave our way through the fabric of medieval life, we find ourselves at the heart of a bustling medieval town. The air is filled with the chatter of townsfolk, the clanging of the blacksmith's hammer, and the distant hum of a lute. The narrow and winding streets are lined with timber-framed houses that lean precariously over the street, their second stories jutting out over the first, defying gravity. The overhanging upper floors of medieval houses were designed to maximize living space without encroaching on the street below, a clever solution to the challenge of limited urban space. Unlike modern homes, most medieval houses were multifunctional. The lower floor often served as a workshop or a shop, while the family resided in the rooms above. These compact and practical homes lacked the comforts and conveniences we take for granted today. There was no running water, central heating, or electricity. Instead, people relied on wells or nearby rivers for water, used fireplaces for warmth, and lit candles or rushlights for illumination. Privacy was also a luxury that many could not afford. Entire families often slept in one room, sharing their quarters with apprentices or servants. This close living quarters, combined with the lack of sanitation, meant that illness could spread rapidly through a household. It was not uncommon for entire families to be wiped out by diseases such as the bubonic plague, which devastated the population of Europe in the 14th century. Medieval towns were notorious for their dirtiness. Without a proper sewage system, waste was often thrown into the streets or dumped into rivers. This lack of sanitation, coupled with the close living quarters, made towns breeding grounds for disease. The stench, as you can imagine, was overwhelming. Visitors to medieval towns often commented on the foul smell that permeated the air, a potent mix of sewage, rotting food, and animal waste. Despite these harsh conditions, medieval towns were hubs of activity. They were the economic heart of medieval society, where goods were produced and traded. Towns were home to a variety of craftsmen, including blacksmiths, bakers, weavers, and brewers, all of whom played a vital role in the economy. Markets were held regularly, drawing people from the surrounding countryside to buy and sell goods. In addition to their economic function, towns also served as centers of social and political activity. Towns were often fortified with walls and towers, providing protection to their inhabitants during times of war. They were also home to important institutions like the church and the town hall, which played crucial roles in the governance and spiritual life of the community. Towns also offered opportunities for social mobility. While the rural peasantry was largely tied to the land, townspeople had the chance to accumulate wealth through trade and crafts. This led to the emergence of a new social class, the bourgeoisie or middle class, who wielded significant economic power. However, life in medieval towns was not solely about work. There were also opportunities for leisure and entertainment. Fairs and festivals were common, providing a chance for people to socialize and enjoy themselves. Music, dance, and theater were popular forms of entertainment, and taverns were a favorite gathering place for townsfolk. But as we move away from the hustle and bustle of the town, let us remember that while life in the Middle Ages was undoubtedly challenging, it was not devoid of moments of joy and celebration. Despite the hardships, people found ways to create meaningful lives, find happiness, and dream of a better future, an enduring testament to the resilience of the human spirit. As we continue our journey through this captivating period in history, let us carry with us not only an understanding of the challenges faced by those who lived in medieval times, but also a profound appreciation for their resilience, ingenuity, and unwavering hope. As we delve deeper into the fascinating and somewhat harsh realities of daily life during this period, we will explore the stark contrast between the medieval lifestyle and the comforts and conveniences we enjoy today. It's not difficult to comprehend why surviving in such times would be a daunting task for many of us. Firstly, the concept of hygiene as we understand it today was vastly different during the Middle Ages. Bathing was not a daily practice, and public baths served more as social gathering spots than places of cleanliness. The water in these communal washrooms was rarely changed throughout the day, resulting in the last person to bathe essentially washing in the dirt and grime of everyone who had bathed before them. This lack of personal hygiene contributed to the outbreak of diseases, including the infamous Black Death. Now, let's delve into the dietary habits of the medieval population. The medieval diet was not particularly diverse or nutritious. Meat was a luxury that only the wealthy could afford regularly. On the other hand, the poor primarily relied on a diet consisting mainly of grains and vegetables. This lack of dietary variety often led to malnutrition and other health issues. Moreover, the cooking methods of the time were primitive, leading to food that was often overcooked or undercooked, causing digestive issues. The dwellings of the medieval period were far from comfortable. The majority of the population lived in small, cramped cottages made of wattle and daub, which were poorly insulated, making them freezing cold in winter and stiflingly hot in summer. Additionally, these houses lacked proper ventilation, resulting in a smoky, stuffy atmosphere from the cooking fires. The role of women in medieval society was vastly different from today. They were largely confined to the domestic sphere, with their duties revolving around raising children and managing household chores. They had very little autonomy or rights and could not own property or hold positions of power. This lack of independence and self-determination would undoubtedly be a shock to modern sensibilities. The concept of entertainment was also vastly different in the Middle Ages. Without the luxury of technology, people had to find amusement in simpler, more physical activities, such as sports like archery and wrestling, as well as communal events like fairs and feasts. However, these forms of entertainment often carried risks of injury or even death, especially in events like jousting tournaments. Religion played a central role in medieval life, with the church holding great power and influence. Daily life was governed by religious observances and rituals, and any deviation from the church's teachings was viewed with suspicion and often met with severe punishment. This rigid adherence to religious doctrine often stifled intellectual and scientific progress. Employment in the Middle Ages was primarily agricultural. The work was grueling and the hours were long, often from sunrise to sunset. There was no concept of weekends or holidays, and workers were expected to toil endlessly for their survival. This level of physical labor would be unfamiliar and likely unbearable to many of us today. Lastly, the medical practices of the Middle Ages were rudimentary at best. Doctors had a limited understanding of the human body and diseases, and their treatments often involved bloodletting or the use of leeches. There were no antibiotics or painkillers, and surgery was a risky endeavor, often resulting in death. As we delve into the realities of medieval life, it becomes evident that the hardships and challenges of this era would make survival incredibly difficult for those accustomed to modern conveniences. The next time you yearn for the simplicity of the past, remember the trials and tribulations faced by people during the Middle Ages and take a moment to appreciate the comforts and conveniences of our modern world. As we continue our historical exploration, we uncover more about the human spirit and resilience, perhaps gaining a deeper appreciation for our own times. As we journey through the Middle Ages, let's explore the daily life of a commoner, a stark contrast to the knights and nobility we've previously discussed. Imagine waking up to the first light of day, the air still cool and crisp as the rooster's crow echoes across the village. A simple straw mattress would serve as your bed, and your blanket might be a rough-spun woolen cloth. Your house, likely a single room shared by your entire family, would be constructed from wattle and daub, woven sticks filled with a mixture of mud, straw, and dung. This construction offered little insulation against the cold or the noise of the village waking up. Your first task of the day would be to tend to the animals. This could involve milking the cows, feeding the chickens, and letting the pigs out to forage. These animals were vital to your family's survival, providing food, milk, and even clothing. Consequently, they were often treated with a level of respect and care that might seem unusual to modern sensibilities. Next, you would turn to the day's chores. If you were a man, your tasks might include working in the fields, planting or harvesting crops depending on the season. You might also spend time chopping wood for the fire, mending fences, or repairing tools. If you were a woman, your day would be filled with tasks such as spinning wool into yarn, weaving cloth, cooking meals, and tending to the children. The work was arduous, with little time for rest. Lunch, often a simple piece of bread and cheese, was consumed in the fields or by the fireside. The afternoon brought more chores and work in the fields. Perhaps a trip to the village well for water, or a visit to the local mill to grind grain into flour was in order. As the sun began to set, the village came alive with the sounds of evening. The cows were brought in from the fields, the chickens cooped up for the night, and the fire stoked for the evening meal. This meal, often a simple stew of vegetables and whatever meat was available, was a time for the family to gather, share the day's news, and enjoy each other's company. After the meal, there might be a few hours for relaxation. Perhaps you would sit by the fire, mending clothes or carving wooden utensils. Perhaps you would listen to stories told by the elders, tales of heroes and monsters passed down through generations. Or perhaps you would simply sit in quiet contemplation, staring into the fire and dreaming of a better life. By the time you crawled into bed, the fire would be dying down, and the only sounds would be the soft snoring of your family and the distant hoot of an owl. You would fall asleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring more of the same, more work, more chores, more struggles, but also more moments of joy, more stories, and more dreams. Life in the Middle Ages was hard, but it was not without its moments of beauty. The changing of the seasons, the birth of a new lamb, and the harvest of the crops were all occasions for celebration. The sense of community was strong, with everyone working together for the common good. And despite the hardships, people found ways to enjoy life, laugh, love, and dream. So, as we continue our journey through the Middle Ages, let's not forget the common people, the men and women who worked the land, raised the animals, and kept the fires burning. Their lives may seem difficult to us, but to them, it was simply life. In that life, they discovered moments of joy, beauty, and peace. And isn't that, after all, what we all seek in our own lives? As the night deepens and the stars twinkle overhead, let your mind wander back to those simple, hard-working people of the Middle Ages. Imagine their lives, their struggles, and their joys. And as you drift off to sleep, remember that we are all connected, through time and space, by the simple act of living, working, and dreaming. We have journeyed through the harsh realities of life in the medieval period, examining societal dynamics, basic amenities, and the physical and mental tolls of the era. As we continue our exploration, we delve deeper into the arduous daily routines of a medieval person. The day would typically start at dawn. Medieval people didn't have the luxury of alarm clocks, but they did have nature's own alarm system, the crowing of the rooster. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, the rooster's call would echo through the countryside, signaling the beginning of a new day. The medieval household would stir, with the lady of the house being among the first to rise. Her tasks were manifold in a largely agrarian society. She tended to the garden, milked the cows, and ensured that the livestock were well fed and cared for. She also prepared meals, cleaned the house, and cared for the children, the elderly, and the sick. The husband, meanwhile, had his own set of tasks. Depending on his profession, he might spend his day tilling the fields, shoeing horses, crafting tools, or constructing buildings. The work was physically demanding and often dangerous, as there were no safety regulations to protect workers, and accidents were common. Children in the Middle Ages did not have the luxury of a carefree childhood. They were expected to contribute to the household from an early age. Once a child reached the age of 7, they could be sent away to work as an apprentice or a servant in another household. The concept of childhood as a time of innocence and play is a relatively modern idea. In the medieval times, education was not a priority. Most people were illiterate, and formal education was reserved for the privileged few. The church was the primary source of education, and monks were among the most educated people of the time. They would spend their days in monastic libraries, painstakingly copying out manuscripts by hand. Despite the hardships of daily life, medieval people did have leisure time. They enjoyed music, dancing, and games. The church also provided entertainment through its numerous feast days and festivals. These were times of celebration and merriment when people could forget their toil for a while and simply enjoy themselves. However, even in their leisure time, the harsh realities of life in the Middle Ages were never far away. The spectre of disease was always present, with outbreaks of illnesses such as the bubonic plague decimating entire communities. Lack of sanitation and understanding of disease transmission made these outbreaks often deadly. As we conclude this section, we are reminded of the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the harsh realities of life in the medieval times, people found ways to survive, thrive, and find joy in the midst of adversity. As we close our eyes and imagine the sounds of the rooster crowing, the smell of the morning dew, and the rhythmic patterns of daily life, we can appreciate the simple beauty of life in the Middle Ages. In the next section, we will delve into the intricacies of medieval politics and the role of the church in shaping society. But for now, let's allow the images of daily life in the Middle Ages to lull us into a peaceful sleep, a reprieve from the rigors of our own day-to-day existence. As we journey through the medieval period, we explore the realm of education and social mobility. Unlike today, education was not a universal right, but a privilege reserved for the nobility and clergy. The common folk, comprising the majority of the population, were usually illiterate. Their children learned their parents' trades, with sons becoming farmers, craftsmen, or fishers, while daughters learned domestic skills from their mothers. To comprehend education in the Middle Ages, we must first understand the Church's central role as the sole provider of knowledge. Monasteries served as the primary centers of education, offering basic Latin, grammar, and arithmetic to boys destined for the clergy. These schools also provided scholarships for talented boys from less privileged backgrounds. In contrast, noble children were tutored at home by private teachers. They received a comprehensive education in Latin, Greek, philosophy, theology, and the sciences, along with practical skills like horse riding, sword fighting, and household management. Girls, regardless of their social status, received limited formal education. Instead, they learned domestic skills essential for their future roles as wives and mothers, such as spinning, weaving, household management, nursing, and food preparation. While some noble girls were taught to read and write, this was an exception rather than the norm. For ordinary men and women, life in the medieval era revolved around survival. Medieval life was characterized by harsh realities that limited intellectual pursuits. Peasants toiled from dawn till dusk in the fields, while craftsmen honed their skills in their trades. Evenings were reserved for rest and recovery, preparing for the next grueling day of labor. Despite these hardships, there was a slim chance for social mobility. A commoner could potentially elevate his status through various means. An apprentice could become a master and establish his own business. A peasant could save enough money to buy his own land and become a landowner. A soldier could distinguish himself in battle and be awarded a noble title. However, these opportunities were scarce, and most people remained in their social class of birth. The medieval justice system also played a significant role in the lives of common people. Courts were often biased in favor of the nobility, and punishments for crimes were severe. Common punishments included fines, public humiliation, and physical harm such as flogging or mutilation. For the most serious crimes, the penalty was death, often by hanging or beheading. Interestingly, the concept of prisons as places for long-term incarceration didn't exist. Prisons were primarily used to hold individuals awaiting trial or punishment. This was partly because the state didn't want to bear the cost of housing and feeding prisoners for extended periods. Additionally, the harsh nature of medieval punishments was believed to deter crime. In conclusion, a day in medieval times was fraught with challenges and hardships. Survival often took precedence over education and personal growth. Opportunities for social mobility were rare, and justice was often harsh and biased. Despite these challenges, the people of the medieval period demonstrated remarkable resilience, ingenuity, and tenacity. These qualities have shaped human history and continue to influence our world today. As we conclude this section of our journey, let your mind absorb this rich tapestry of life in the medieval era and let it guide you into a deep and peaceful sleep. Let us not forget the significance of religion during this time. Indeed, the religious aspect of life in the Middle Ages dominated much of the social, cultural, and political landscape. The Church wielded considerable power, influencing not only spiritual matters, but also the daily lives of ordinary people. To understand the Middle Ages, we must comprehend the Church's role in this period. During this time, the Church was the single largest unified organization in Europe. It preserved scholarship and literacy during a time when much of Europe was in disarray. Monasteries scattered across the continent became centers of learning and education. Monks hand-copied books in the scriptoria, preserving ancient texts that might otherwise have been lost. The Church's influence extended beyond spiritual matters. It touched every aspect of daily life. It dictated the calendar, marking the year with religious festivals and holy days. It provided welfare for the poor and needy, ran schools and hospitals, and even served as the primary legal institution. Ecclesiastical courts, overseen by the Church, dealt with a wide range of issues, from marriage and inheritance disputes to criminal cases. The Church was also deeply intertwined with politics. Monarchs and nobles vied for the Church's favor, seeking its endorsement to legitimize their rule. The Pope, as the head of the Church, wielded considerable power, often acting as a mediator in disputes between kingdoms. The Church also possessed its own territories and armies, and it was not uncommon for it to be embroiled in military conflicts. In the spiritual realm, the Church held a monopoly over salvation. The prevailing doctrine of the time asserted that salvation was exclusive to the Church, and this belief profoundly influenced people's lives. The fear of eternal damnation served as a potent motivator, compelling individuals to adhere to the Church's teachings and participate in its rituals. Daily life was intricately intertwined with the rhythms of the liturgical calendar, with regular attendance at Mass, confession, and other sacraments. However, life in the Middle Ages was not entirely dominated by piety and devotion. There was also room for merriment, celebration, and even a touch of irreverence. Medieval people had their festivals and feasts, their dances and games. While the Church may have disapproved of some of these activities, it was often powerless to prevent them. The Church may have held sway over the landscape, but it did not completely control the hearts and minds of the people. And yet, the Church was not a monolithic entity. It was characterized by divisions and conflicts, both internal and external. There were disputes over doctrine, power struggles within the hierarchy, and conflicts with secular authorities. The Church faced challenges from heretical movements such as the Cathars and the Lollards, who questioned its teachings and authority. The Church also faced criticism for its wealth and corruption, leading to calls for reform. Despite these challenges, the Church remained a powerful and influential institution throughout the Middle Ages. It provided a sense of stability and order in a tumultuous world, offering hope, comfort, and the promise of salvation. It was a source of authority, education, and welfare, deeply ingrained in the fabric of medieval society. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine the tolling of church bells, the chant of monks in the monastery, and the bustling activity of a medieval fair during a church holiday. Consider how deeply the Church influenced every aspect of life in the Middle Ages. As you close your eyes and surrender to sleep, remember that our exploration of medieval times continues as we delve deeper into this captivating period. In our journey through medieval times, we've visited robust castles, bustling marketplaces, and laborious farmlands. We've learned about the intricate social structures and the profound significance of religion. Now, as we embark on the third section of our journey, let's turn our attention to the challenging daily routines and the fascinating culture of these ancient times. Imagine waking up with the sunrise, the light filtering through the narrow slits that serve as windows in your modest wooden home. Your bed, unlike the plush comfort we're accustomed to today, would likely be a hard straw mattress, possibly shared with other family members. The concept of privacy as we know it today didn't exist in the same form during the medieval period, especially for the lower classes. As you rose from your bed, you'd need to tend to your animals. Chickens would need feeding, cows milked, and horses groomed. These tasks were crucial, as these animals provided vital food and livelihood. They offered eggs, milk, meat, and their manure was used to fertilize fields. If you were fortunate enough to have breakfast, it would consist of simple fare like bread, cheese, and perhaps a portion of last night's stew to break your fast. However, food was often scarce, especially during winter. You'd need to ration it carefully to ensure it lasted until the next harvest. Once your initial tasks were done, it was time for your day's work. If you were a peasant, it would likely involve a long day of physically demanding labor in the fields. You'd be expected to plow, sow, and harvest crops, a task made even more challenging by the primitive tools available. If you were a craftsman, your day would be filled with meticulous creation. Blacksmiths would labor over hot forges, shaping metal into tools, weapons, and household items. Tailors would painstakingly stitch garments, while carpenters would construct furniture and buildings. Regardless of your occupation, the workday would be long and arduous. There were no weekends or holidays as we know them today. You'd work from dawn until dusk, with only a brief pause for a midday meal. This meal, known as the main meal, would be more substantial than breakfast. It might include a thick stew, a chunk of meat, and perhaps a piece of fruit or a handful of nuts. Despite the hardships, there would be moments of leisure in medieval times. You might engage in a game of chess or backgammon, or perhaps participate in a lively dance at a local festival. Music was also an integral part of medieval life, with troubadours traveling from town to town, sharing songs and stories as the day drew to a close. You would return home to prepare for the evening meal, which was usually more modest than the midday meal, often consisting of leftovers or a simple porridge. After the meal, you would gather around the hearth, sharing stories and songs with your family as the flames flickered and the darkness crept in. You would then retire to your straw bed, ready to start the cycle again with the next sunrise. As we delve deeper into the narrative of the medieval times, we can appreciate the stark contrast between our modern conveniences and the rigorous routines of the past. We can marvel at the resilience and resourcefulness of the individuals who navigated through these challenging times. As we tuck ourselves into our comfortable beds tonight, we can reflect on the lessons we can learn from history and how it shapes our understanding of the present and the future. At the heart of the medieval period, also known as the Middle Ages, was the feudal system, a social structure that dictated the roles and responsibilities of every individual within society. At the top of this hierarchy was the king, who was believed to rule by divine providence. Below the king were the nobles, who swore their fealty to him. These included dukes, barons, and earls, collectively known as the lords of the realm. Their oath of loyalty entailed a promise to provide the king with knights for military service, a practice prevalent during this era of frequent territorial disputes. In return for their loyalty and service, the king granted these noblemen land, also referred to as fiefs. These lands were worked by serfs or peasants who were bound to the land and were not permitted to leave without the lord's permission. It's crucial to remember that serfdom was not considered slavery, but it was far from a life of freedom. Serfs were compelled to work the land, cultivating crops and raising livestock, which could be claimed by their lord at any time. Additionally, they were obligated to pay taxes and were subject to the lord's justice. The life of a serf was incredibly arduous. They resided in small, cramped cottages with thatched roofs and walls constructed from wattle and daub, a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung. These homes provided minimal protection from the elements, and during the winter months they could become unbearably cold. The majority of a serf's time was spent working the fields from dawn until dusk, with no weekends or days off. Their diet was poor and monotonous, consisting primarily of pottage, a thick soup made from peas, beans, and onions. If they were fortunate, they might have some cheese or a bit of bacon to complement their meal, but for most, the diet was vegetarian out of necessity, not choice. It was a time when the saying, "you are what you eat," took on a literal meaning, as malnutrition was rampant and led to a host of health problems. In contrast, the life of a noble was one of relative luxury. They lived in castles or manor houses, fortified structures that provided protection and comfort. Their diet was varied and plentiful, with meats, fish, fruits, and vegetables regularly on the menu. In addition to their duties to the king, nobles also had responsibilities to their serfs, such as providing protection and ensuring justice was served. However, the application of justice was often skewed in favor of the nobility, with serfs receiving harsher punishments for the same crimes. Medieval society was deeply religious, with the Catholic Church playing a central role in people's lives. The Church dictated the calendar with numerous saints' days and religious festivals, providing a break from the relentless toil of fieldwork. These festivals also provided an opportunity for people to come together as a community, with feasting, drinking, and games. However, the Church also wielded significant power and influence, with bishops and abbots often acting as advisors to the king. The Church had its own system of law, known as canon law, which was used to regulate matters of faith and morality. This included everything from marriage and divorce to heresy and blasphemy. Those found guilty of breaking canon law could face severe punishments, including excommunication, which was a form of social and spiritual death. Despite the hardships and challenges of life in the Middle Ages, people found ways to find joy and meaning. Music and dance were significant forms of entertainment, with troubadours and minstrels traveling from town to town, singing songs and sharing stories. Craftsmen took pride in their work, creating beautiful objects from wood, metal, and stone. While their lives may have been short and often filled with hardship, the people of the Middle Ages also understood the importance of community, family, and faith. As you drift off to sleep, consider the stark contrasts of medieval life: the lofty castles and humble cottages, the lavish feasts of the nobility, and the simple pottage of the serfs, the stern justice of the Lord, and the mercy of the Church. Remember that while the Middle Ages may seem harsh and unforgiving, it was also a period of great change and innovation, laying the foundations for the world we know today. As we delve deeper into the realities of life in medieval times, we find ourselves in the heart of a bustling town. In contrast to the triumphant castles and serene countryside, these urban areas were crowded, dirty, and filled with the stench of human and animal waste. Sanitation was still centuries away from being understood or implemented. Open sewers ran through the streets, and rainwater was the only method of cleaning. People often tossed their waste out of their windows, adding to the squalor. This was a far cry from the cleanliness and hygiene we enjoy in the modern world. Diseases were rampant and often deadly in these conditions. The Black Death, or the bubonic plague, was the most infamous, sweeping through Europe in the 14th century and killing millions. Yet, it was far from the only danger. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and typhoid were all common and devastating without modern treatments or understanding of disease transmission. Medicine was a blend of superstition, herbal remedies, and prayers. The idea of germs and the necessity of cleanliness in preventing illness was simply not understood. In addition to disease, the risk of injury was always present. In a society devoid of safety regulations, accidents were commonplace. If fortunate, one might merely break a bone. However, if not, one could be maimed or even killed. Even if one survived without proper medical care, permanent disabilities could still result. The concept of workers' rights and welfare would not be introduced for centuries to come. Food and drink in the Middle Ages were vastly different from what we know today. The poor often subsisted on a diet of bread, porridge, and vegetables. Meat was a luxury, often reserved for the wealthy. Most people drank ale or beer, as water was frequently too polluted to drink safely. While we might romanticize the idea of a hearty medieval feast, the reality was often much more mundane and nutritionally deficient. Religion held a central role in every aspect of medieval life. It influenced law, education, and social structure. The church wielded significant power and could dictate the course of a person's life. Heresy was considered a serious crime, and punishments could be severe. The concept of religious freedom, as we understand it today, did not exist. Education was also a privilege of the wealthy. For the poor, life revolved around survival. Children were expected to work from a young age, often in the same trade as their parents. There were no child labor laws to protect them. Literacy rates were low, and books were expensive and rare. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century revolutionized access to information. But for the majority of the Middle Ages, knowledge was held by a select few. Women's rights were severely limited during this period. Most women were expected to marry and produce children, often while still in their teens. They had little say in these arrangements, as marriages were typically arranged for political or economic gain. Once married, a woman was expected to obey her husband in all things. Education for women was rare, and the idea of a woman holding power was often met with suspicion and fear. Despite these harsh realities, it's crucial to remember that people in the Middle Ages weren't merely enduring their lives. They found joy in family, community, and faith. They celebrated with feasts and festivals, created beautiful works of art and architecture that we still admire today, and lived their lives with the same depth of emotion as we do. However, as modern individuals accustomed to a certain standard of living, we would find the Middle Ages a challenging, if not impossible, time to survive. The lack of sanitation, the risk of disease and injury, the limited diet, the strict social hierarchy, and the lack of rights for women and children all make this a period that we can appreciate for its historical significance, but one that we wouldn't want to experience firsthand. As we continue to explore the past, let these insights lull you into a deep sleep, carrying with you a newfound appreciation for the comforts and conveniences of the present. As we delve deeper into the harsh realities of the medieval period, our focus shifts to the realm of health and medicine, an area where the Middle Ages were particularly unforgiving. The field of medicine was in its infancy, and the understanding of the human body and its ailments was largely based on speculation, superstition, and a significant amount of trial and error. Primary healthcare was often provided by the lady of the house or a local wise woman, without the benefit of scientific knowledge or sterile environments. Remedies were concocted from various sources, such as plants, herbs, and animal parts, and treatments were often more akin to rituals than to what we recognize as medical practice. These remedies were passed down from generation to generation, an echo of a time when oral tradition was the primary means of preserving knowledge. Imagine suffering from a headache or a toothache and being prescribed a poultice of mashed herbs or a potion brewed from the bark of certain trees. In more severe cases, practices like bloodletting were prevalent, based on the belief that draining the body of bad blood would cure the patient. These procedures were often performed by barber surgeons who also cut hair and performed minor surgeries and amputations. The iconic barber's pole, featuring a white and red color scheme, symbolizes this practice, with the red representing blood and the white signifying bandages, as anesthesia and pain management were rudimentary at best. Patients were often given strong drinks to numb the pain or physically restrained to prevent movement. Consequently, the survival rate after these procedures was extremely low, with infections rampant and the concept of sterilizing instruments or washing hands unheard of. Medieval medicine also had a primitive understanding of mental health. Conditions we now recognize as psychological or neurological were often attributed to spiritual or demonic influence. Treatments for these ailments were more ritualistic and religious, involving exorcisms, prayer, and other religious practices. Epidemics and plagues were common occurrences during the medieval period. The most infamous was the Black Death, a pandemic that swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, claiming the lives of between 75 and 200 million people, approximately 30 to 60% of Europe's population at the time. The cause of this devastating disease was the bacterium Yersinia pestis, transmitted through fleas on black rats. However, without the knowledge of bacteria or disease transmission, people were helpless against the plague, often believing it to be a divine punishment. Theories about the plague's cause ranged from planetary misalignment to Jewish persecution, leading to widespread persecution of Jewish communities. Some people even believed that the disease was airborne, leading to the emergence of plague doctors who donned beaked masks filled with herbs and spices to purify the air they breathed. Despite their efforts, the plague continued to ravage Europe until the late 17th century. Despite the hardships and health risks, people in the Middle Ages managed to survive, albeit with a significantly lower average life expectancy compared to today. The resilience and resourcefulness demonstrated during this time laid the foundation for many of the advancements in medicine and healthcare that we benefit from today. As we conclude this section of our journey, it's important to remember that while the Middle Ages were undoubtedly challenging, they also represented a period of remarkable human endurance and innovation. Life was not easy, but it was not impossible either. As we delve deeper into the past, we continue to learn more about our ancestors' struggles and triumphs, and how they shaped the world we live in today. Stay with me, dear listener, as we continue our journey into the past. As we peel back the layers of history, we gain insights into the resilience of our ancestors, the challenges they faced, and the world they created for us to inherit. Now, let's turn our attention to the daily life of a medieval serf, the lowest-ranking member of the feudal system. The life of a serf was filled with hardships and toil, a stark contrast to the romanticized notions of chivalry and courtly love that often characterize our understanding of the Middle Ages. The day of a medieval serf began with the crowing of a rooster long before the sun rose. They were required to work long hours in the fields, starting early in the morning and ending late in the evening. The labor was grueling and the hours long, as serfs were responsible for tilling, planting, and harvesting the crops that sustained the entire manor. Their diet was humble and monotonous, consisting mainly of dark bread made from rye or barley, pottage, and ale. Meat was a luxury seldom enjoyed, and the serf supplemented their diet with vegetables from their garden plot and occasionally fish from the local river or stream. In terms of shelter, a medieval serf's home was simple and rudimentary, often a one-room structure made of wattle and daub with a thatched roof. Inside, there were few furnishings, such as a rough-hewn table, stools, and a chest for storing clothes and valuables. Windows lacked glass, and the floor was simply the bare earth covered with straw or reeds for insulation. Despite the hardships they faced, serfs had a rich cultural life. They celebrated the changing of the seasons and the agricultural calendar with festivities and feasts, music, dance, and storytelling. For serfs, the church was the center of community and spiritual life. They were obliged to attend Mass every Sunday and on holy days, providing them with a respite from their labor. Religion offered them hope for a better life in the hereafter, and the church acted as a unifying force, binding the community together. However, serfdom was not a static condition. There were different ways in which a serf could gain freedom. Some bought their way out of serfdom, while others were set free by their lords as a reward for exceptional service. In some cases, a serf could also gain freedom by escaping to a city and living there for a year and a day without being claimed by their lord. The life of a serf was a life of unending toil and hardship, but it was also a life of community, shared experiences, and resilience in the face of adversity. Despite the challenges they faced, medieval serfs were not mere passive victims of their circumstances. They found ways to survive, create joy, forge connections with their fellow serfs, and carve out a sense of identity amidst the constraints of their status. As we conclude this section, let us reflect on the resilience of these individuals who lived in a time so different from our own. Let us also remember that the strength of the human spirit transcends any particular era or social class. It is a universal quality, as timeless as history itself. As you drift off to sleep, let the strength of the serfs, who in the face of adversity found ways to survive, create joy, and forge connections, lull you into a deep and restful sleep. In the next section, we'll explore the role of women in medieval society, a topic often overlooked in historical narratives. The story of medieval women is one of resistance and resilience, navigating a world that offered them limited freedoms. But for now, let the gentle rhythms of the serf's life lull you into a deep and restful sleep. Now, let us venture into the realm of medieval occupations, jobs, and trades. During this period, people undertook often back-breaking and monotonous work. The majority of people in medieval society were peasants, whose lives were dictated by the seasons and the demands of the land. Peasants rose with the sun and worked until it set. Their primary occupation was farming, and they spent most of their time tending to the fields. The work was grueling, with long hours spent ploughing, planting, and harvesting. The tools were primitive, and the work was done mainly by hand. The physical demands of this lifestyle were immense, requiring a level of endurance and resilience that many of us in the modern world would struggle to match. Additionally, a peasant's life was one of servitude, as they were tied to the land and the lord who owned it. In exchange for the right to live and work on a piece of land, peasants were obligated to provide a portion of their produce and labor to their lords. This could involve tasks like repairing the lord's castle or supplying a specific amount of grain annually. Peasants were also required to grind their grain at the lord's mill and purchase goods from the lord's market. These obligations were non-negotiable, and failure to fulfill them could result in punishment or even eviction. Life in towns and cities, however, was somewhat different. The medieval economy was dominated by guilds, which were associations of artisans and merchants that controlled the practice of their craft within a particular town. To join a guild, individuals first served as apprentices, learning the trade's skills under the guidance of a master. After several years of training, apprentices became journeymen, earning wages for their work. Finally, after demonstrating their expertise and knowledge, journeymen could become masters and establish their own workshops. Craftsmen worked long hours, often from dawn until dusk, producing a wide range of goods, including clothes, shoes, furniture, and tools. While their work was skilled, it was also repetitive and physically demanding. For instance, blacksmiths spent hours hammering iron into shape. Weavers worked at their looms, creating cloth from raw wool or flax, and bakers rose before dawn to prepare bread for the day. Similar to peasants, craftsmen were subject to various obligations and restrictions. They were required to pay fees to their guilds and adhere to its rules and regulations. These regulations could dictate the quality of goods produced, the prices charged, and the working hours. Additionally, craftsmen were subject to the laws and taxes of the town or city they resided in. Even those in positions of power and privilege faced their own challenges. For example, the nobility was obligated to provide military service to the king. This could mean leading troops into battle or providing soldiers and equipment for the king's campaigns. Nobles were also expected to administer justice, collect taxes, and manage the lands and people under their control. These responsibilities demanded a level of skill and judgment that was not easily acquired. The life of a monk or nun was equally challenging. Monastic life was governed by strict rules and routines. Monks and nuns were required to pray regularly throughout the day and night and engage in manual labor. They were also expected to live a life of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The physical demands of this lifestyle, combined with the mental and spiritual discipline it required, made it a difficult path to follow. In conclusion, life in the medieval period was not easy, regardless of one's social status. The work was hard, the hours were long, and the rewards were often meager. Despite these challenges, people found ways to survive and even thrive. They developed skills and crafts that are still admired today. They built communities and institutions that have shaped the world we live in, and they left a legacy that continues to fascinate and inspire us. As we drift into sleep, let us take a moment to appreciate the strength and resilience of our medieval ancestors. Their lives may have been hard, but they were also rich and meaningful in their own ways. As we journey back to medieval times, we find ourselves in the midst of a bustling town. The air is filled with the aroma of freshly baked bread, the sound of blacksmith hammers striking metal, and the hum of a lively market. Yet beneath this seemingly idyllic facade, a harsh reality dictated the rhythm of everyday life. Let us step into the shoes of a common peasant. As a serf, you would be part of the lowest social class, bound to the land and subject to the will of the local lord. Your day would begin before sunrise, as the cock crowed, signaling the start of your labor. You'd likely reside in a modest, simple dwelling constructed from wattle and daub with a thatched roof, a stark contrast to the comforts of modern living. This home would be shared with your family and possibly some livestock, as animals were often brought indoors for warmth and protection from thieves. Your diet would be sparse and unvaried, consisting mainly of bread made from barley or rye, supplemented by vegetables like beans and cabbages. Meat would be a rare luxury, reserved for special occasions or the local lord's table. Instead, you might have a bit of cheese or a few eggs from your chickens. Water was often unsafe to drink, so you'd rely on ale or mead for sustenance. The work was backbreaking and monotonous, requiring you to toil in the fields, planting and harvesting crops, tending to the livestock, and performing any other tasks the Lord commanded. This physically exhausting labor left little time for leisure or personal growth. Education was a privilege reserved for the clergy and the nobility, so you'd most likely be illiterate, relying on the local priest for information about the world beyond your village. Healthcare in medieval times was primitive at best. The prevailing theory was based on the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, believed to cause illness due to imbalances. Treatments often involved bloodletting or purging. Without the knowledge of germs or proper sanitation, disease spread rapidly, leading to a low life expectancy. The church held a significant role in everyday life. Sundays and holy days were reserved for worship, and failing to attend Mass could result in punishment. It was also the center of social life, where villagers gathered for festivals and fairs. However, the church wielded considerable power, capable of excommunicating anyone who violated its laws, effectively cutting them off from society. As a serf, you lacked the freedom to shape your destiny. You couldn't leave the land without the Lord's permission, and your children would inherit your status. The concept of upward mobility was virtually non-existent, and individual rights didn't emerge for centuries. Despite these harsh realities, medieval times weren't devoid of joy and camaraderie. Festivals, feasts, and celebrations of the changing seasons provided respite, while the simple pleasure of a well-done job brought happiness. Music, dance, and storytelling were integral to the culture, offering solace from daily hardships. As we move forward, it's evident that our lives are vastly different from those of our medieval ancestors. We enjoy comforts and freedoms they could scarcely imagine. However, it's also important to remember the resilience and determination of these people who lived and loved, worked and played in a world so different from ours. Their stories remind us of our capacity to adapt and endure, to find joy amidst hardship, and to build a sense of community and purpose even in the most challenging circumstances. As we delve into the daily life of a medieval person, let's focus on the aspect of health and medicine. In medieval times, the healthcare system was significantly different from what we know today. The understanding of disease, its causes, and treatment was limited, leading to a short life expectancy due to various health issues. Knowledge of anatomy was rudimentary at best. Dissecting human bodies to comprehend their workings was considered taboo and often illegal, leaving many physicians to make educated guesses about the inner workings of the human body. This lack of understanding resulted in numerous misconceptions and misdiagnoses. The belief in the four humours, black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood, was prevalent. These were believed to be bodily fluids that needed to be in balance for a person's health. Any imbalance was considered the root cause of all diseases and illnesses. Bloodletting was a common treatment practice, aiming to drain the body of excess bad humours. Leeches were often used for this purpose. In today's medical understanding, this practice is largely considered harmful and ineffective. However, in medieval times, it was a widely accepted form of treatment, often leading to weakness and sometimes death due to blood loss. Hygiene, or the lack thereof, was another factor that made it difficult for a modern person to survive in medieval times. Bathing was not a regular practice and was often considered an indulgence. The concept of germs and sanitation was not understood, leading to widespread diseases. The Black Death, a plague that decimated a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, serves as a stark reminder of this lack of sanitation and understanding of disease transmission. Medieval diet also played a significant role in the health of the people. The lower classes primarily subsisted on a diet of mostly grain, such as barley and rye, with limited meat and fresh fruit and vegetables. This lack of a balanced diet often resulted in malnutrition, weakening the immune system and making individuals more susceptible to diseases. Dentistry was also in its infancy. Tooth decay was a common problem. often leading to dangerous infections. Without the understanding of dental hygiene and effective treatments, toothaches were often lifelong issues for many. Childbirth was particularly dangerous for women. There was a lack of understanding about cleanliness and the need for sterile environments during childbirth, leading to a high rate of maternal and infant mortality. Midwives who were not formally trained physicians usually attended births. Their knowledge was based on experience rather than formal education, resulting in many complications and fatalities. Despite these challenges, the medieval period witnessed some advancements in medicine. The establishment of universities in the 12th century paved the way for the development of medical schools, where knowledge was compiled and imparted. Monasteries emerged as centers of healing, with monks possessing expertise in herbs and remedies. Hospitals also emerged during this era, although they primarily served as places for the impoverished and ill to succumb to their ailments rather than institutions dedicated to healing and recovery. In conclusion, health and medicine in the medieval period were fraught with challenges. The lack of understanding about the human body, diseases and hygiene made it a perilous time to live. The available treatments were often ineffective and sometimes even harmful. However, it was also a period of gradual progress, laying the foundations for modern medicine. As we embark on our final section of this journey, let us reflect on the resilience of the human spirit and the indomitable drive for survival that propelled people through these arduous times. As we continue our peaceful exploration of the heart of the medieval period, our focus shifts from the bustling life of cities and castles to the quieter, yet equally significant, rural countryside. Here, in the vast expanses of fields and forests, the majority of the medieval population engaged in farming and labor. Their lives were intricately intertwined with the rhythms of the seasons and the bountiful gifts of the earth. Life in a medieval village was far removed from the romanticized tales of chivalry and courtly love that often accompany this era. It was characterized by a simplicity and routine that, for many modern individuals, would be intolerably monotonous. The day for a medieval peasant would commence at dawn, with the crowing of the roosters heralding the start of their day. After a modest breakfast consisting of bread, cheese, and weak ale, they would venture out to the fields for a long day of labor. The agricultural practices of the medieval period were rudimentary compared to today's standards. Without the aid of modern machinery, every task was performed manually. Plowing, sowing, weeding, and harvesting were physically demanding activities that demanded strength, endurance, and a great deal of patience. Despite their hard work, the yield from their labor was often meager. Poor soil quality, unpredictable weather, and rampant crop diseases posed constant threats of failure and famine. The diet of a medieval peasant was similarly austere. They primarily consumed bread, porridge, and vegetables, with occasional small amounts of cheese and meat. The monotony of their diet was occasionally broken by the availability of seasonal fruits, nuts, and berries. However, these were often preserved for the winter months when food was scarce. Health and hygiene were another area where the medieval period fell short by modern standards. Without understanding the principles of germ theory and sanitation, illness was rampant and often deadly. Child mortality rates were high and life expectancy was low. Common ailments like toothaches, colds, and digestive issues were often treated with a mix of folk remedies and superstition. More serious illnesses, like the plague, could wipe out entire communities. Despite these hardships, the life of a medieval peasant was not without its small joys and comforts. The village was a close-knit community where everyone knew each other, and social activities like dances, feasts, and fairs provided much-needed relief from the daily grind. The church, too, played a central role in village life, offering spiritual comfort and a sense of order in a world that was often chaotic and unpredictable. The medieval period was also a time of innovation and progress in many areas. Advances in technology, such as the heavy plough and the horse collar, made farming more efficient. The establishment of guilds and the development of trade routes helped stimulate economic growth. The construction of cathedrals, castles, and universities reflected the period's artistic and intellectual achievements. However, despite its progress, the medieval world was a place of profound inequality. The feudal system, which governed social and economic relations, heavily favored the nobility and clergy. peasants had few rights and limited opportunities for social mobility. Their lives were defined by their labor, and their status was determined by their birth. Reflecting on the realities of life in the medieval period, it's easy to understand why modern individuals might find it difficult to survive a day in this era. The physical demands, lack of comfort, and constant uncertainty would test even the most resilient among us. However, there is also a certain beauty in this simplicity, a reminder of the resilience and adaptability of the human spirit. As we drift further into the tranquil embrace of sleep, let us carry with us this sense of gratitude for the comforts and conveniences of our modern life, and a newfound appreciation for the trials and triumphs of our medieval ancestors. As our journey through history continues, we find ourselves delving into an era of knights, castles, and feudal society, the medieval times. Imagine yourself transported back through the centuries, landing in a world far removed from our own. It's a time of stark contrasts, where the wealthy live in fortified castles while the poor toil in the fields. The church wields immense power, and one's fate is often dictated by the whims of their lord. As we begin to explore this fascinating era, we can start to understand why the comforts and conveniences we take for granted today would make it incredibly challenging for a contemporary person to survive a day in medieval times. Firstly, let's consider the living conditions. If you were a peasant, the most likely scenario, given the vast majority of people belong to this class, your dwelling would be a small, one-room cottage. Constructed from wattle and daub, a mixture of mud, straw, and manure, this cottage would be shared with your family and animals. The floor would be strewn with straw and covered in animal dung, while the air would be thick with the smell of smoke from the central hearth. A far cry from our modern houses, with separate rooms, indoor plumbing, and central heating. Regarding food, a peasant's diet would consist largely of pottage, a thick stew made from seasonal vegetables and grains like barley or oats. Meat would be a rare luxury, and fresh fruit and vegetables would be scarce during the long winter months. Fast food, convenience meals, and the abundance of food we enjoy today would be unimaginable in the medieval era. The daily routine would be grueling. As a peasant, you would be expected to work the fields from dawn until dusk, regardless of the weather. There would be little time for leisure or relaxation, and your duties would extend beyond farming to include tasks such as repairing the lord's road or building his castle. This stark contrast is evident in our modern work-life balance, where we have the luxury of weekends, holidays, and the ability to work from home. Healthcare, or rather the lack thereof, is another factor that would make survival in the medieval times challenging. Without our modern understanding of germs and disease, medieval doctors often resorted to dubious treatments like bloodletting and leech therapy. Add to this a lack of sanitation and the prevalence of diseases such as the plague, and it's clear that staying healthy in the medieval era would be a formidable task. In addition to these physical challenges, there would also be social and cultural obstacles to navigate. As a peasant, your life would be dictated by the lord of the manor. You could be called upon to fight in his wars, and your life would be subject to his whims. The concept of individual rights and freedoms, which we take for granted today, was largely absent in the medieval era. The church, a significant political and social institution, also held considerable influence. It dictated moral standards, influenced laws, and even played a role in education. Religious freedom, as we understand it today, would be alien in this context. Furthermore, the lack of technological conveniences made life challenging. Without electricity, there would be no lighting after sunset except for candles or oil lamps. There would be no telephones, internet, cars, trains, smartphones, or computers. Even simple tasks like washing clothes or preparing food would be labor-intensive and time-consuming. In conclusion, while the medieval era is a fascinating period to study, it's clear that the harsh living conditions, lack of modern conveniences, and rigid social structures would make it incredibly difficult for a person from our time to survive a day in this era. However, as we delve deeper into this period, we'll gain a greater appreciation for the resilience and ingenuity of our ancestors, who not only survived but thrived in these challenging times. As you drift off to sleep tonight, spare a thought for our medieval ancestors and take a moment to appreciate the comforts and conveniences of our modern world. Remember, history is not just about understanding the past, but also about gaining perspective on the present. Good night. As the early morning fog lifts slowly from the cobblestone streets, we find ourselves in a bustling medieval town centre. The air was filled with a cacophony of sounds, the clatter of horse hooves, the chatter of townsfolk, the hammering of blacksmiths, and the cries of street vendors. Life in medieval times was anything but quiet. It was a symphony of existence, a far cry from peace. For serfs, the lowest social class, the day began long before the sun rose. Bound to the land and effectively owned by the local lord, serfs had no rights and were forced to work long hours, often in the fields tending to crops and livestock. Despite the back-breaking labor, they were not paid. Instead, they were given a small piece of land to grow their own food. Even children as young as 7 were expected to contribute, their small hands perfect for tasks like pulling weeds or feeding chickens. The diet of a medieval serf was simple and monotonous. If fortunate enough to have breakfast, it might consist of a hunk of bread and a bit of cheese. Dinner, the main meal of the day, was typically a vegetable pottage, a thick soup made from whatever was available, including cabbage, onions, leeks, and beans. Meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions, and the average serf only tasted it a few times a year. Hygiene, or the lack thereof, was another challenge of medieval life. Baths were infrequent, with most people washing only their hands and face. This lack of personal hygiene, combined with unsanitary living conditions, led to a multitude of health problems. Fleas and lice were common, as were skin diseases and infections. It's no surprise that the average life expectancy was only around 30 years. Medieval towns were not only noisy and dirty, but also dangerous places to live. Without a police force, crime was rampant, and punishment was harsh. Thieves could be publicly humiliated in the stocks, while more serious crimes could result in execution. Fire was another ever-present danger. Most buildings were constructed from wood and closely packed together, making a single spark capable of igniting a devastating blaze. While the nobility enjoyed a more comfortable lifestyle, it came with its own set of challenges. The noble class was expected to provide military service to the king, often requiring them to leave home for extended periods. Women in the noble class had slightly more freedom than their peasant counterparts, but they were still expected to marry for political advantage and bear heirs. Medieval life was a constant struggle for survival, from the back-breaking labor of serfs to the political maneuvering of nobility. Each individual played a vital role in this intricate societal structure. Despite the hardships, people found joy in their lives, celebrating with feasts and festivals, creating beautiful works of art, and passing down stories through the ages. As we delve deeper into medieval times, we'll explore the daily lives, beliefs, and culture of the people. We'll examine the role of the church, the rise of universities, and the flourishing of literature and art. Despite the challenges, there's much to admire about this resilient society, which has left an indelible mark on our own. As the twilight descends upon our medieval town, we're left with a sense of awe and appreciation for the people who lived, loved, and endured in these challenging times. So, as you drift off to sleep, let your mind wander through the cobblestone streets, bustling markets, and grand castles of the medieval era. Imagine the serfs tending to their fields, the nobility riding off to war, and the children playing in the streets. Despite the hardships, there's a beauty and resilience in this era that continues to captivate us centuries later. And as you drift off to sleep, let the sounds, sights, and stories of the medieval times lull you into peaceful dreams. As we explore the daily lives of people in medieval times, it's essential to recognize the pivotal role of labor and work. In medieval Europe, the majority of the population, known as serfs, were awakened each morning by the rising sun to commence their tasks. Their days typically began at the crack of dawn, sometimes even before the sun had fully risen. The concept of a weekend was non-existent, and serfs labored from dusk till dawn, 6 days a week, with only the Sabbath day reserved for religious observance. The labor was grueling and demanding. Serfs, essentially peasants, worked on the lord's land in exchange for protection. Their duties included cultivating fields, tending to animals, and performing any other tasks deemed necessary by their lord. From sowing seeds in the fields to threshing the harvested grain, every task was manual and often involved heavy lifting and strenuous physical exertion. The tools they used were rudimentary, made from wood and iron, requiring considerable strength and endurance to operate. Serfs' lives were not their own. Their existence was dictated by the demands of their lord and the changing seasons. The working conditions were harsh, and they lived in constant insecurity. Without any rights or freedoms, serfs were entirely at the mercy of their lords. They could be evicted from their homes, their meager possessions seized, or their families torn apart at the lord's whim. Additionally, they were burdened with crippling taxes and rents, often in the form of crops or labor. Medieval serfs lived a life of chronic uncertainty and lack of control, making their existence as stressful as their diet. Their meals were bland and monotonous, consisting mainly of dark bread made from rye or barley, and pottage, a thick stew made from grains, vegetables, and occasionally a small amount of meat. Meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions or during the winter months. Water was often contaminated and unsafe to drink, so they drank like ale or mead. Fruits and vegetables were part of their diet, but these were seasonal and not always readily available. Medical care during the medieval period was rudimentary at best. Knowledge of medicine was limited, and most treatments were based on superstition and folklore rather than science. Illnesses were often attributed to supernatural causes, and the remedies were equally bizarre. For instance, bloodletting was a common treatment for various ailments, the idea being to balance the four humours of the body: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, by removing excess blood. It was believed that restoring this balance could cure the disease. Needless to say, this often did more harm than good. Beyond the physical hardships, the mental strain was equally taxing. The life of a serf was monotonous and unchanging, with few opportunities for leisure or recreation. The church provided some solace with its promise of a better life in the hereafter. Serfs clung to their faith, finding comfort in the rituals and ceremonies of the church. The occasional feast days and holy days offered a respite from the drudgery of daily life and were eagerly anticipated. Life in a medieval city was not much better than in the countryside. Cities were crowded and filthy, with narrow winding streets and inadequate sanitation. Disease was rampant, and epidemics were common. Houses were small and cramped, often housing multiple families. The air was thick with smoke from numerous fireplaces and the foul odor of open sewers. The daily grind of a craftsman in a city was not vastly different from that of a serf. Both worked from dawn till dusk, 6 days a week. However, unlike serfs, craftsmen had the chance to improve their circumstances through skill and hard work. They could become masters of their craft, own their own shops, and even achieve wealth. But this path was not easy, and demanded years of apprenticeship and relentless effort. In essence, life in the medieval era was a constant struggle for survival. Whether you were a serf toiling in the fields or a craftsman plying your trade in a city, the daily grind was grueling. The harsh working conditions, inadequate diet, poor medical care, and constant insecurity made life in the medieval period incredibly challenging, to say the least. It's hard not to feel a sense of relief and gratitude for the comforts and conveniences of modern life. As we drift off to sleep tonight, let's take a moment to appreciate the hardships our ancestors endured and the progress we've made. Good night. As we journey through the Middle Ages, we've explored the social hierarchy, daily chores, cuisine, and health and hygiene challenges. Now, let's turn our attention to another harsher aspect of medieval life: the justice system. The concept of justice in the Middle Ages was vastly different from what we understand today. Modern legal systems are based on the principle of innocent until proven guilty. However, in medieval times, the burden of proving innocence often fell on the accused, and failure to do so could result in severe punishment. Witch trials, perhaps the most infamous example of medieval justice, were certainly not the only form of trial. Other methods included trial by combat, trial by ordeal, and compurgation. Each method was more terrifying than the last. Trial by combat, for instance, was exactly as it sounds. The accused and the accuser would fight, and God would supposedly grant victory to the innocent party. It's easy to imagine how this system could be easily manipulated by those with strength or fighting skill. Trial by ordeal was similarly gruesome. The accused would be subjected to a physically painful or dangerous task, such as carrying a hot iron for a certain distance or retrieving a stone from a pot of boiling water. If their wounds healed cleanly within a set time, they were considered innocent. If not, they were guilty. This method was based on the belief that God would intervene on behalf of the innocent, a notion that seems dangerously naive to us now. Compurgation, on the other hand, required the accused to swear an oath of innocence, backed by a group of oath helpers who would vouch for their honesty. This method relied heavily on one's reputation within the community, and could be easily skewed by personal bias. Punishments for crimes varied widely. They ranged from fines to corporal punishment to death. The severity of the punishment often depended on the social status of the accused and the nature of the crime. For example, a nobleman might be fined for a crime that would earn a peasant a whipping or worse. Beyond the legal system, violence was a common part of everyday life in the Middle Ages. Raids and skirmishes were frequent, and personal safety was far from guaranteed. The lack of a centralized police force meant that people had to take their safety into their own hands, often leading to brutal reprisals and cycles of violence. And then there were the wars. The Middle Ages were a time of near-constant conflict, from the Crusades to the 100 Years' War. These wars were not only deadly, but also incredibly disruptive to daily life. They could lead to food shortages, displacement, and widespread destruction. Beyond these physical hardships, the psychological toll of living in such uncertain times cannot be overstated. The constant threat of violence, the fear of accusation, and the general unpredictability of life would have been incredibly stressful. It's hard to imagine getting a good night's sleep under such conditions. Despite these hardships, people in the Middle Ages found ways to adapt and survive. They developed systems of mutual aid and protection, such as guilds and confraternities. They sought solace in religion and found joy in festivals and feasts. However, it's clear that life in the Middle Ages was far from easy. The harsh realities of medieval justice, the ever-present threat of violence, and the psychological stress of living in such a time would be enough to challenge even the most resilient souls. It serves as a stark reminder of how far we've come and a testament to the human spirit's resilience. As we close this chapter, let's take a moment to appreciate the relative comfort and security of our modern lives. While we still face challenges and uncertainties, they pale in comparison to the trials of medieval times. So, as you drift off to sleep, be grateful for the peace and safety of your own bed, and for the progress that has been made over the centuries. Good night. In our exploration of life during the medieval era, we now delve into the realm of law and order, a subject that further highlights the challenges faced by a modern individual in this time. The legal system of the Middle Ages was vastly different from the one we are familiar with today. Instead of a unified, codified structure, it was a patchwork of local laws and customs, overlaid with the edicts of lords, kings, and the church. This system was often arbitrary and harsh, reflecting the harsh realities of medieval life. The medieval legal system was closely intertwined with the feudal system that dominated the political landscape. Lords wielded significant powers over their vassals and serfs, including the authority to administer justice and punish crimes. They often acted as judges, juries, and executioners, and their decisions were susceptible to personal biases and vendettas. Moreover, justice was frequently meted out in public spectacles designed to deter others from committing crimes, a stark contrast to our modern notions of due process and the right to a fair trial. The punishments and penalties imposed for various crimes during the Middle Ages were incredibly harsh by today's standards. Thieves could be branded or mutilated, while murderers faced the ultimate punishment of hanging or beheading. Even lesser offenses, such as slander or defamation, could result in public humiliation or corporal punishment. Furthermore, the concept of trial by ordeal emerged as a means of determining guilt or innocence. This practice involved subjecting the accused to physically dangerous or painful tests, with the belief that God would intervene to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. For instance, in the ordeal of hot iron, the accused was required to carry a red-hot piece of iron. If their hand healed cleanly within a specified time frame, they were deemed innocent. Otherwise, they were found guilty. The church also played a significant role in the medieval legal system. Ecclesiastical courts, run by the church, dealt with cases involving clergy members and certain types of moral offenses. These courts followed their own set of rules, known as canon law, which was based on biblical teachings and the writings of church fathers. Penalties could range from excommunication to penance, such as fasting or making a pilgrimage. Despite its many flaws and harshness, the medieval legal system had some redeeming qualities. For instance, it recognized the concept of sanctuary, which allowed criminals to seek refuge in a church and be protected from arrest. This offered a path to mercy and forgiveness, aligning with Christian teachings of the time. Moreover, the system laid the groundwork for many of the legal principles and institutions we take for granted today, such as the Magna Carta, a landmark document signed in 1215. The Magna Carta established the principle that the king was subject to the law, not above it. This marked a significant step towards the rule of law, a concept central to our modern legal system. While the medieval legal system was undoubtedly harsh and unpredictable, it was also a product of its time, reflecting the social norms and religious beliefs of the period. And while most of us would undoubtedly struggle to navigate its complexities and deal with its brutalities, it's also worth remembering that it was part of a broader historical process that eventually led to the development of more fair and equitable systems of justice. It's a reminder that, for all its brutality and unfairness, the past can also be a source of learning and growth. In our next section, we'll delve into the world of medieval warfare, another aspect of life in the Middle Ages that would certainly pose challenges for a modern individual. From the chivalrous knights and their code of honor to the grand battles and sieges, we'll delve into the realities of combat during this era and the profound impact it had on those who lived through it. As you drift off to sleep, let your mind wander to these distant, tumultuous times, and remember that the struggles and hardships of the past have shaped the world we inhabit today. Medieval life was far from the romanticized adventures depicted in tales of knights and damsels. It was a time of hardship, relentless work, and survival. Imagine waking up at the crack of dawn, not to the blaring of an alarm clock, but to the crowing of a rooster or the tolling of a church bell. Your bed would be a straw pallet shared with other family members for warmth. You would rise, rubbing sleep from your eyes, and begin your day of strenuous labor. This routine would repeat itself 7 days a week, with no weekends, holidays, or vacations. The concept of leisure time was alien, and the day was strictly divided into periods of work, prayer, and sleep. Most people in medieval times were peasant farmers living in small rural communities. Their lives were governed by the seasons and the cyclical nature of crops. Spring brought the time for plowing and planting, while summer was dedicated to tending the fields. Autumn was the harvest season, and winter was a time of preparation for the next year. The work was backbreaking, requiring simple tools that demanded great physical effort. Peasants toiled in the fields from dawn till dusk, with only a brief respite for a midday meal. Food was a constant concern in medieval times, as it directly impacted survival. The diet was monotonous, consisting mainly of dark, coarse bread made from rye or barley. Peasants might supplement this with vegetables from their gardens, such as beans, peas, onions, and cabbages. Meat was a luxury, usually reserved for special occasions. Life was challenging, but it wasn't devoid of moments of joy and celebration. For instance, harvest time was a time of communal effort and shared happiness. Medieval towns were dirty, crowded, and noisy. The narrow, unpaved streets were lined with wooden houses that were prone to fires. Sanitation was poor, with waste often thrown into the streets or into open pits. Diseases were rampant, with outbreaks of plague and other illnesses regularly decimating the population. Despite these challenges, towns were vibrant places, teeming with a variety of trades and crafts. Blacksmiths, bakers, tailors, carpenters, and many others contributed to the bustling economy of the town. The church held a central place in everyone's life, providing a moral framework and a sense of community. It offered hope and solace in a harsh world, promising eternal life in heaven. The church controlled many aspects of daily life, including education. Most people were illiterate, and the few who could read and write were usually members of the clergy. Medieval medicine was a blend of superstition, herbal remedies, and religious belief. Doctors were rare and expensive, so most people relied on the local wise woman or herbalist for treatment. Many diseases and injuries were beyond the understanding and capability of medieval medicine, leading to high rates of mortality. Warfare was a constant threat in medieval times. Knights and soldiers were highly trained in combat, but the majority of fighting men were ordinary peasants, called up to serve their lord in times of conflict. Battles were brutal and bloody affairs, devoid of any concept of human rights or the treatment of prisoners. Despite the hardships and dangers of medieval life, people found ways to enjoy themselves. Festivals, feasts, dances, and games were common, and music and storytelling played significant roles in culture, providing an escape from the harsh realities of life. The medieval world was also deeply spiritual, with a strong belief in the supernatural. People believed in witches, fairies, and other magical beings, and these beliefs were often intertwined with religious ones. In conclusion, life in medieval times was tough and challenging. It was a world of hard work, simple pleasures, and constant dangers. However, it was also a world of community, spirituality, and resilience. Despite all the hardships, people found ways to survive and even thrive. It's a testament to the human spirit that even in the harshest of times, people found ways to create beauty and meaning. As you drift off to sleep, remember the resilience and strength of our medieval ancestors and let their stories inspire you. Now let's delve into the judicial system of the medieval era, a topic that always seems to intrigue historians and enthusiasts alike. In medieval times, the rule of law was quite different from what we know today. The concept of innocent until proven guilty was almost foreign, and the methods for determining guilt were often bizarre and sometimes brutal. Without advanced scientific methods to investigate crimes, medieval societies relied on superstition and divine intervention to dispense justice. The concept of trial by ordeal was widely used during this period. If an individual was accused of a crime, they had to undergo a physically challenging, sometimes life-threatening task to prove their innocence. These ordeals could involve carrying a red-hot iron bar, plunging a hand into boiling water, or even sinking or floating in a body of water. The latter, based on the belief that water, considered a sacred substance, would reject a guilty person, causing them to float. The medieval judicial system heavily relied on compurgation, a process where an accused person could swear an oath of innocence, supported by a group of oath helpers. These individuals, usually friends, family, or community members, essentially vouched for the accused's character. If the accused could gather enough oath helpers, they had a chance of being acquitted of the crime they were charged with. However, the reliability of this system was questionable, as biases and personal relationships could easily influence the outcome. Feudal lords, who had been granted land by the king, were often responsible for maintaining law and order within their territories. They held their own courts and decided punishments as they saw fit, which could lead to inconsistency in sentencing. Punishments varied greatly from one region to another, and the lord's personal biases could affect the outcome. In the medieval era, punishments were usually severe in public, designed to deter potential criminals. Common forms of punishment for minor offences included the stocks, the pillory, and public floggings. For more serious crimes, the guilty were subjected to hanging, beheading, or burning at the stake. Despite the harsh and often unpredictable nature of the medieval judicial system, there was an effort to establish a more uniform legal system in the 12th century. This marked the birth of the common law system, which remains the foundation of the legal system in many English-speaking countries today. King Henry II of England played a pivotal role in this development. He established a system of royal courts that travelled across the country, hearing cases and enforcing the same set of laws everywhere they went. This ensured that the same laws and punishments applied to everyone, regardless of their location, providing much-needed consistency in the law. However, the common law system was far from flawless. It was still heavily influenced by the whims of the king or his appointed judges, and the concept of a fair trial as we understand it today was still a distant dream. Nevertheless, it was a significant step towards the modern judicial system we are familiar with. Thus, we can see that living in medieval times was not for the faint-hearted. The societal norms, the harsh living conditions, and the brutal judicial system would have made everyday life a constant struggle. The uncertainty and unpredictability of the law, combined with the heavy reliance on superstition and divine intervention, would have added to the sense of dread and fear that permeated the era. The medieval era was indeed a time of darkness and hardship, but it was also a time that laid the foundations for many aspects of our modern society. Despite its flaws, The development of the common law system was a crucial step towards establishing a fair and consistent judicial system. As we close our eyes and drift off to sleep, we can appreciate the comforts and conveniences of our modern lives. We can feel grateful for the progress we've made as a society and look forward to a future where justice is determined by the strength of evidence and the pursuit of truth, rather than by the heat of an iron bar or the depth of a body of water. As the day in the life of a medieval person continues, the sun reaches its zenith, casting long dark shadows across the cobblestone streets. The medieval town is at its busiest, with people going about their daily chores. The air is thick with the smell of livestock, firewood, and the tantalizing aroma of freshly baked bread from the local bakery. The bakery itself is a hive of activity, with the baker's apprentices kneading dough, stoking the ovens, and the master baker overseeing it all. His practiced eye would meticulously inspect each loaf, ensuring it met the stringent quality standards of the era. Bread, a staple food in medieval times, held a dual purpose. It served as sustenance and as a plate known as a trencher. After meals, the trencher, soaked in gravy and sauces, was consumed or distributed to the less fortunate. Meanwhile, in the bustling marketplace, traders from distant lands showcased their exotic wares. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and ginger, considered luxuries in medieval times, were displayed in ornate boxes, their fragrant aroma captivating passers-by. Merchants engaged in loud and competitive advertising, vying for customers' attention. The marketplace also served as a hub for news and gossip, adding a social dimension to the commerce of the day. At the town's edge, the local blacksmith was immersed in his work, the rhythmic sound of his hammer striking metal echoing through the streets. The blacksmith's role was pivotal in a medieval town, as they crafted and repaired everything from horseshoes and weaponry to tools and nails. Often revered for their essential skills, blacksmiths were also respected figures due to their work with fire and metal, elements believed to possess mystical properties. Life for the town's children was not solely filled with play. As young as 7, they were expected to assist their parents with tasks such as gathering firewood, caring for animals, and helping in the fields. Despite these responsibilities, children found time for games, engaging in various pastimes that continue to be enjoyed today. Marbles, hopscotch, and tag were among the popular games. As the afternoon sun began its descent, the monotonous tolling of the church bell summoned the townsfolk to prayer. The church stood as the heart of a medieval town, serving as a place of worship and a community center where important decisions were made and disputes were resolved. The clergy not only provided spiritual guidance but also education, as literacy was limited to a privileged few. At the local castle, the lord and his lady managed their estate. The lord was responsible for protecting his people, maintaining law and order, and presiding over court cases. The lady of the castle had her own duties, including managing the household, supervising servants, and overseeing meal preparation. As the day ended, taverns filled with patrons seeking respite from their work. Ale was the preferred drink, often safer than water, which could be contaminated. Music, storytelling, and games of chance provided entertainment as the townsfolk relaxed and socialized as the sun set. The town gradually quieted down, fires were extinguished, doors were bolted, and people retired to their beds, ready to start another day in the medieval world. This glimpse into medieval life reveals a period marked by harsh realities, but also by a sense of community and shared values that shaped our world today. Thus, we conclude another day in our journey through the Middle Ages, a time of chivalry, hardship, tradition, and transformation. Close your eyes and let the sounds of the past lull you into a peaceful slumber as we prepare to explore a new day in the life of a medieval villager in our next section. Good night, dear listener. As we continue our exploration of daily life in medieval times, we now turn our attention to the often harsh and challenging living conditions. The comforts of modern life, which we take for granted, were far from possible in the medieval era. Most people lived in small rural villages. Their houses were typically made of wattle and daub, a mixture of sticks and mud, with thatched roofs made of straw or reeds. These modest dwellings offered some protection from the elements, but they were far from comfortable. There were no glass windows, instead, shutters could be closed to keep out the cold. The floors were simply compacted earth, covered in straw to provide some insulation. Within these homes, families lived in close quarters, and privacy was a luxury few could afford. In most cases, the entire family would sleep in the same room, often in the same bed. Furniture was sparse, consisting of a table, perhaps a few benches or stools, and a chest for storing belongings. Life was dictated by the rhythms of nature. People rose with the sun and went to bed when it set. They ate what they could grow or raise themselves. The diet was predominantly plant-based, with a heavy reliance on grains. Bread was the staple food, supplemented by vegetables, fruits, and occasionally meat. Medieval people had to be self-reliant. They made their own clothes, grew their own food, and built their own homes. They had to know how to care for animals, mend fences, and repair tools. Every member of the family had a role to play, from the youngest child to the oldest adult. Healthcare, as we understand it today, did not exist. People relied on a mixture of folk remedies, herbal medicines, and religious rituals to treat illness. Disease was a constant threat, made worse by poor sanitation and a lack of understanding about how diseases spread. Plagues and epidemics were common, and mortality rates were high. The concept of leisure time was also foreign to the medieval mind. Every waking hour was consumed by the struggle to survive. There were no weekends, holidays, or vacations. Entertainment was limited to occasional feasts or festivals, often linked to religious holidays. The role of religion was central to medieval life. The church was not just a place of worship, it was also a community center, a school, and often the largest and most impressive building in the village. Religious rituals and observances punctuated the daily routine, providing a sense of structure and order amidst life's uncertainties. Despite these hardships, people in the medieval era found ways to endure and even thrive. They formed close-knit communities, relying on each other for support and mutual aid. They developed skills and crafts that are still admired today, and they left us a rich cultural legacy in the form of literature, art, architecture, and music. Living in the medieval era was undoubtedly challenging, but it was also a time of innovation, resilience, community, faith, strength, and perseverance. It shaped our world in countless ways, and its influence can still be felt today. As we conclude our exploration of the medieval era, let us remember not only the hardships and challenges, but also the achievements and enduring legacy of this fascinating period in history. As we drift off to sleep, we can take comfort in knowing that we are the beneficiaries of centuries of human ingenuity and resilience, standing on the shoulders of those who came before us. Good night and sleep well.